here a little bit looking back on a story we had out in February on Estee Lauder where CEO Fabrizio Freda said, "I'm not going anywhere." So.
Very prescient. Yep.
But Red, I don't know how much of an expert you are on the beauty care market and skincare, but are they an outlier here as far as, you go through 1 million earnings reports every quarter? Are they an outlier as far as that, consumer discretionary space? Or are we seeing similar stories from other, companies that depend on, I don't know, whether it's beauty care or, high fashion? Is there a theme here?
I don't know what gave it away that I'm not an expert in the beauty space, but
you do have good skin. I'll say that.
No, I don't think they're an outlier. Look, I think you see something, for me, the similar trend that I'm picking up across all of the retail, even something as far away as Home Depot, is that people are focused on needs, not wants. And this luxury space, skincare especially, is a want. It's not a need. Fragrance is a want, not a need. So consumers are cutting back where they can, whether it's fixing your house up or making yourself appear a little bit better. It doesn't matter. That's kind of the macro pressure is going to win out in this scenario.
But as our good friend Samantha writes in, Alex Steele has always told us that you have to invest in your face, which she does. And John Tucker and I do not. So, and we can tell.
Clearly my face is a value stock at this point
exactly.
Right now.
But all I know is during the lockdown, across the street, the Sephora store is packed.
Yeah,
I mean, no matter what, people need to get that stuff.
Yeah, I guess in the pandemic, people had a few extra bucks. They weren't spending on concerts and movies.
It shocked me how strong that category is.
Yeah.
And then right after the pandemic as well, they did really well because people were like, I'm emerging from the world. I want to make sure I look okay. I haven't shaved my face in 6 months. I might as well get a moisturizer or something. But it's those trends have just fallen off now, and they haven't really returned to like pre-pandemic levels of growth. Estee Lauder was a company that was like really flying into the pandemic and through the pandemic, and then just the fall off of China, and then the United States as well is kind of not getting a lot of attention at the moment, but U.S. sales contracted as well this quarter. It's maybe hidden because there's been so much emphasis on China. But those are their two biggest markets, and both are underperforming, I think, at the moment. So
it still seems like China's consumer economy is a bit of a black box to analysts. Do you find a lot of surprises, either upside or downside, on companies as far as their business in China goes?
Yeah, it's hard to get a read because if you think there was so much worry, and again, jumping around here, but I just connecting all the different kind of earnings threads, there was so much worry going into Apple's report of where's the Chinese consumer? Are they buying iPhones? Things like that. It's the same dollar that's going towards these things. But it's really hard to get a read because Apple outperforms, Estee Lauder underperforms. It is just a kind of, most of the analysts they sit here in New York, they're just looking at data points. So it is kind of a tough read.
And looking at the stock of Estee Lauder, looking at the chart here, it peaked at about $370, literally on the last trading day of 2021, down 75% since then.
Wow.
From 370 to here we are at 94, so a big move here. And I guess the next, NVIDIA is coming up. That's still not for another week or so, right? I think.
Yeah, that's next Wednesday.
I mean, they're so late in the earnings cycle. I don't know why. I'm sure there's a story there. But, man, it feels like the market's going to be hanging on that one. Are the expectations as high as they always have been for NVIDIA?
Yeah, they will, of course. They will be flying extremely high into that report. And then if we think kind of about the AI story of this earnings season is that people have been maybe investing a little bit too much. We're not seeing the growth that we would have liked out of those investments. But of course, NVIDIA is on the other side of that. They're the ones receiving a lot of that investment. So could be, again, kind of the outperformer of that group. But yeah, definitely very high expectations. And with high expectations, there's high risk as well.
Yeah, anything else on your radar, Red, that you're looking for? We're in that kind of weird period for earnings where you only get the stragglers. Is there anyone else we should really keep an eye on?
Yeah, I mean, it's continue with the retail stocks over the next week, especially. I'm just trying to think. There's like 1,000 names running through my mind now.
But the retailers, they tend to come late in the cycle.
Yeah.
But it's going to be good read on the consumer, and then again, as you mentioned, that the NVIDIA coming up is just going to be huge, not just for like NVIDIA itself or the tech stocks in general, but I think the market overall.
Yeah, it really seems like it's will show us the money phase of the AI craze right now. So you know, and NVIDIA might be the outlier there, but.
All right, well, we'll stay on top of it.
else.
Well, I'm sure we'll be talking to you, Red Brown, earnings reporter, Bloomberg News, joining us live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio here, looking at the market. A little bit of a lift to the screen, not going to make a whole lot about it. It is August, kind of getting into dog days here. The S&P up 0.3%. The NASDAQ up about 0.1%. The Russell giving us a little bit on the small cappers, up about 0.5%. So a little bit of outperformance there from the small cap stocks. Yields, 10-year Treasury, pretty much unched on the day. Call it 3.87%. Commodity front, oil a little bit weaker, just above $76 an ounce. Bitcoin off 2.3% here today. So the volatility continues there for Bitcoin, about 58,400 on that cryptocurrency. Call that out for Tom Keene, of course. We're going to have more coming up. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
Company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
In the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, I'm Lisa Mateo. Advanced Micro Devices making a big move to take on NVIDIA in the AI chip space. Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta has more.
AMD agreeing to acquire server maker ZT Systems in a $4.9 billion deal. Now, this is really interesting because when you traditionally see a M&A deal like this, traditionally the acquirer tends to drop, the shares drop. It's a traditional kind of M&A arbitrage, and simply is because they're kind of having this big expenditure. This morning, you are seeing the exact opposite.
Yeah, we're seeing AMD up nearly 3%. Taking a look at NVIDIA right now, up about 0.8%. NVIDIA actually opens its books next week. Other other deal-making news, we've been hearing about Circle K operator Couche-Tard making a bid for 7 & I. That's a Japanese convenience store chain operator of 7-Eleven. So right now we have 7 & I up 22% in Japan, Couche-Tard down about 0.3% in Canada. And what's more, Couche-Tard just announced today it's reached an agreement to acquire GetGo Cafe and Markets from supermarket retailer Giant Eagle. Well, a big win for streaming TV service Fubo TV. A judge blocked Fox, Warner Brothers Discovery, Walt Disney from launching their streaming sports service Venue Sports. It comes a week before it was expected to roll out. We have shares of Fubo TV right now up 29%. And shares of Estee Lauder, they are up about 0.6%. And this is even after a disappointing forecast. The cosmetics company also announced its CEO plans to retire at the end of June 2025. Shares of HP, they're lower. They're actually up a tick right now, up about 0.4%. They had a downgrade from Morgan Stanley. And we have shares of Shake Shack and Dutch Brothers. They are both falling. Piper Sandler cut it to neutral, so Shake Shack down about 1%. Same for Dutch Brothers right now. That is your company news at this hour. I'm Lisa Mateo, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, looking at this market, we got a little bit of green on the screen here. The S&P up about 0.4%, lifting there. The Dow up 0.5%, Nasdaq up 0.3%. The Russell, that's in the small cap stock, the Russell 2000, it's up about 0.5%. With our news in New York City, here's Michael Barr.
Thank you very much, Paul, Michael, Lisa. The Democratic National Convention begins today in Chicago. President Joe Biden will be the keynote speaker in a primetime address. Biden is scheduled to speak at 10:45 p.m. Wall Street time, and Bloomberg will carry it live. Vice President Kamala Harris heads into the convention 4 points ahead of former President Trump in the latest ABC News Washington Post Ipsos poll, but 9 points behind on the economy. Isaac Poltansky is Director of Policy Research at BTIG.
Donald Trump is still leading on the key issues that animate voters in the swing states, right? He still leads on the economy, inflation, and immigration. And those have generally been the three issues that tend to animate, excite, and define the voters' enthusiasm in the 6 to 7 states that will decide this election.
Isaac Boltansky with BTIG was a guest on Bloomberg Brief with Danny Berger and Manus Cranny. On the Republican side, the Trump campaign will be holding events in battleground states this week. Donald Trump will kick things off in Pennsylvania with a rally this afternoon in York. He will also have stops in Michigan, North Carolina, Arizona, and Nevada. Trump's running mate, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, will be out there as well. Vance is dismissing Harris's spike as a honeymoon period.
Kamala Harris got a bit of a sugar high a couple of weeks ago.
Trump will also visit the U.S.-Mexico border. Former New York Congressman George Santos heads to federal court today. Several media outlets say Santos will plead guilty today of multiple counts of fraud contained in a 23-count federal indictment. Finally, we've lost a pioneer TV talk show host. Phil Donahue rose to fame in the late 60s after being the first person to interact with a studio audience. Donahue, who was married to Marlo Thomas, died at the age of 88. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Paul, Michael.
All right, Michael Barr, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Mike Regan sitting in for Alex Steele for this hour here. Michael, interesting story here across the Bloomberg terminal. British tech entrepreneur Mike Lynch is among the people missing after a luxury yacht sank off the coast of Sicily, Italy, according to a person familiar with the matter. One person has died and 6 others are missing after the boat called the Bayazin sank early Monday near Porticello, according to the Coast Guard and firefighters. Lynch's wife, Angela Baccaris, was among those rescued. Now, this was no dinghy here. This was Italy's Coast Guard is leading the search and rescue operations and has recovered 15 people, said the managers of the 56-meter, which is a 184-foot sailing yacht, Camper Nicholson's. 10 crew members on board and 12 guests.
Yeah, still a few missing too. Quite a tragedy. I mean, imagine how strong that storm was to tip a boat that size over.
Yeah, exactly.
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah, this incident comes 10 weeks after Lynch, who was 59, was acquitted in a San Francisco court of criminal charges that he pulled off Silicon Valley's biggest ever fraud relating to the sale of his company, Autonomy Corp, to Hewlett-Packard for more than $11 billion in 2011. A year later, HP wrote down the value of the business by $8.8 billion, and a long-running legal battle followed. So Lynch lost a civil trial in London related to the deal in 2022, was extradited to the U.S., where he stood trial in San Francisco federal court. Again, a jury there found him not guilty on all counts in early June. So what a crazy time and a crazy story here.
Yeah, what a lot of drama surrounding this guy. It's really a fascinating story. And one interesting thing, the spokesperson for Campbell and Nicholson's, they're the actual company that runs the crew on this yacht, said the yacht had actually been at anchor and not navigating as far as they know. So really amazing to think of a yacht that size. I mean, we're looking at a picture of it. It's a sailing yacht, so very tall, super tall mast, and like you said, 180-some feet long. Just a massive vessel to be sunk in a storm off the coast of Italy.
Yep, so we'll keep on top of that. But again, you can check that reporting out on the Bloomberg Terminal, Bloomberg.com. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney.
The real outperformance has been the U.S. corporate high yield.
Are the companies lean enough? Have they trimmed all the fat?
The semiconductor business is a really cyclical business.
Breaking market headlines and corporate news from across the globe.
Do investors like the M&A that we've seen?
These are two big-time blue-chip companies.
The window between the peak and cut changing super fast.
Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, folks, for better or worse, here we go. Matt Miller's going to be sitting in for Alex Steele for the next hour. We'll see how it goes. Fingers crossed. Crystal C is going to join us. She's Bloomberg U.S. Deals reporter. Icahn reaches a $2 million SEC settlement after margin loan probe there. So anytime Carl Icahn's in the news, I want to know what's going on there. And then Rosanna Perro, she's Bloomberg Intelligence consumer staples analyst. There's an M&A trade in the business that kind of got my attention. Couche-Tard is going to buy $31 billion, owner of 7-Eleven stores. Who doesn't love the 7-Eleven and the big Slurpees and all that kind of stuff? So they're in the news. Carol Schleif, CIO at BMO Family Office, she's going to give us her markets outlook here. So we got a lot coming up in this hour with Mr. Matt Miller. But first, let's go to Charlie Pell and get a Bloomberg Business Rush. Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Paul and Matt. Here's what's going on. We got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ solidly in the green, back to work Monday. Best level of the session right now on the S&P, close to it, up 22 points, 55.76, a gain right now of 0.4%. Dow Industrials up 198 right now, up by about 0.5%. NASDAQ up 58, higher by 0.3%. NASDAQ 100 index also up 0.3%. Broad-based rally here for the Russell 2000 index of small cap shares up 0.5%. Bottom line here, stocks higher for an 8th straight day. That is the longest winning streak in 2024. 10-year 3.87%, the 2-year 4.05%. Gold is down 0.3%. Spot gold now at 2,500 even, while West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.6%, 76.20 for a barrel of WTI. Bitcoin 58,559, lower now by 2.1%. Wall Street is looking ahead to Friday's Jackson Hole speech from Fed Chair Jay Powell. Investors will be listening for confirmation from Powell that the Fed will lower rates in September. Kelsey Barrow is Executive Director for Fixed Income at J.P. Morgan Investment Management. She was the guest this morning on Bloomberg Surveillance.
So I actually don't think that Chair Powell needs to say that much. That, though, I think it should be clear that if you look at simple policy rules, they would suggest, and this is regardless of your view on the labor market, simple policy rules would suggest that the appropriate policy rate right now is probably about 100 basis points lower than it is today. And that's just on inflation coming down alone.
Kelsey Barrow of J.P. Morgan Investment Management. Advanced Micro Devices is buying server maker ZT Systems in a cash and stock transaction valued at $4.9 billion, adding data center technology that will bolster its efforts to challenge NVIDIA. Shares of Advanced Micro Devices up now by 3.1%. Recapping stocks higher, S&P starting the week with a gain right now of 24 points, up 0.4%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate that. The Matt Miller sitting in for Alex Steele for the next hour. How about that?
I'm excited. And on potentially the 8th day of gains for the S&P. What a winning streak.
Yeah, I mean, it's in August, so maybe nobody's paying attention, but I mean, 8 days.
It doesn't matter who pays attention if I'm making money, right?
Yep, just look at your 401k and you're all set to go. So Matt Miller and I, we're here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're streaming live on YouTube as well, so you can see Matt Miller as well. You can also see Norma Linda, because she's here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. Looking at what's happening in the markets here. Any stocks getting your attention there, Nora?
Well, I've been keeping an eye on Estee Lauder. We've been talking about it all morning. So I was looking, it was down earlier, declining as much as 2.5%, but now we are seeing a pop. It's into the green. But the news as to why it was down in the red earlier is due to the news that its CEO will be retiring. And of course, this is a long-standing CEO that the company has had for quite a while. But we've also been watching this company because people have been looking for a turnaround story. And unfortunately, this quarter did not put up the metrics that analysts and investors were looking for. And we also did hear news that the CFO will be stepping down as well. So lots going on internally, especially also with those external factors, especially when we think about its presence in China and a lot of these companies really trying to see sales there.
I mean, if I'm a shareholder in this company, I want the CEO and the CFO to leave.
Yeah.
Look at the comp chart.
Yeah, I know.
Pull up Estee Lauder comp.
Crazy.
It's down 52% over the past 5 years. If I put it up against, what's the big one, L'Oreal, or if I put it up against Coty, you know, it's underperforming pretty much every competitor in the business, and it shouldn't be with a name like Estee Lauder, a name that everybody knows,
household
right?
name.
Yeah.
It's been here for so long, you would think that they would be seeing some better numbers. So, I mean, to your point, I think that we are hearing, you know, people excited that, or not excited, but they're hearing, there's a good feeling that these people are stepping aside, I should say, to put it lightly.
Yeah, well, you want to get some new blood in there, right? I notice every single industry group is up, which is why the S&P obviously is gaining. But IT, you know, the chip makers aren't doing quite as well, which is why the NASDAQ 100 is kind of swinging back and forth between gains and losses. What's driving this trade today?
Well, I mean, I'm watching AMD. We're seeing shares of AMD higher after it agreed to buy server maker ZT Systems in a cash and stock transaction that was valued just shy of $5 billion. And this data center technology should hopefully bolster its efforts to challenge NVIDIA, which I believe we'll be hearing from NVIDIA next Wednesday, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, all eyes are on that company. We do know that people have a tendency to have really high expectations, especially when we think about chip makers and just the trade there. People want a lot from this AI story, and it's really important to see whether or not these companies are going to be able to keep up with those high expectations.
That's right. Wednesday's the 28th.
Yep.
NVIDIA makes us wait.
I know.
Right?
I don't know.
Right.
We get through almost all of earnings season, and then NVIDIA, the most important company, arguably, in the stock market.
People are going to have to come back to work that day. ZT Systems located where?
Secaucus, New Jersey.
The tech capital of Jersey.
We just found this out.
I did not know that.
Yes.
I drove through New Jersey.
I know a young man who works
horrible.
at ZT Systems, and he was a little surprised to find out his company was sold today. And so he asked me, do I have to worry? I said, no, you're the reason they're buying the company. Yes. They're buying the smart young people they got there. All right, one more. Fubo TV, because this is near and dear. Laura Martin, by the way, shout out to Laura Martin at Needham. She's been pounding the table on Fubo TV. Once again, right.
Wait, near and dear to your heart, why? Because you
we worked together for
Tell us more.
Many, many
I thought because you watch sports on Fubo.
She's a good buddy of mine. We work together. She's a really good stock analyst out there covering the media sector.
Well, Fubo was doing really well this morning. Its shares are seeing their best day since May of 2023. Shares are up as much as 43% in trading. And this is as it's extending its gains after Fox, Warner Brothers Discovery, and Walt Disney were blocked by a judge from launching their streaming sports service 1 week before its rollout. So we do see Fubo capitalizing on this.
How could they, I mean, how the judge blocked this thing, I have no idea. Or how the Disney people and those people didn't have this thing figured out and wired down.
Right.
I don't get it.
This is a win for Fubo.
It's huge. So good for them. All right, good to Laura Martin at Needham & Company, another great stock call.
But do you buy Fubo? Do you access it as a consumer yourself at home?
Yes.
Yeah.
You do?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. I don't, but I mean, people do. The kids
No, I meant do you?
Do you?
Paul
no, please.
I'm
still paying Brian Roberts at Comcast.
All right, I don't know where to watch live sports. I moved back here from Germany 2 years ago, and I feel I'm not going to get cable, right? Because that's $80 a month. But then I end up paying like $100 a month for all the streaming services I get.
Exactly.
Where do you watch the NFL?
On my Comcast.
Oh, you get cable for it.
Yes, cable and broadband. I still did. I mean, and again, the whole world's coming right back to the cable bundle. because they're gonna have to bundle all these streaming services because you don't want to have 17 different charges on your Visa every month, and they're gonna come right back around to where cable was. Norma Linda, thank you so much. We appreciate it. She covers all the stocks there. All right, our good friend Carl Icahn in the news, but I don't think for reasons he wants to be. Crystal C joins us, Bloomberg U.S. Deals reporter. Crystal, what's going on with our good friend Carl Icahn? He had some issues with the SEC, I think.
Yeah, I think he's probably quite glad about today's news. This is like coming to an end, something that's hung over his head and its firms for a while. Today's news is that his firm and him are settling a charge with the SEC and paying a fine of $2 million combined. And that is an investigation on the back of the Hindenburg research report from 2023 saying that they've inflated some of their asset values and quote unquote operate like a Ponzi scheme. So this is actually in some way good news, even though the stock doesn't quite reflect that today.
Yeah, no, the stock took a hit, I think it was last year in May, when we first learned about these investigations and short sellers started questioning what Carl Icahn's loans were really based on. Does this wrap it up? Is this the end of it?
It looks like the end of it. So there are two investigations. If you remember, this one is the SEC investigation and settlement. The other one, they had previously disclosed that they were contacted by the U.S. Attorney's Office. And today they put out a statement, IEP and Icahn put out a statement saying that they haven't received any substantive communication from the U.S. Attorney's Office since the initial approach. So I guess you can take it as a good sign. No news is sometimes good news. Not for us reporter, but for an investment firm like them,
This was a $50 company, $50 plus, and now it's a $15 company.
Yeah, so what's
and shares are down today as well.
All right, I'm just looking at the stock here, as Matt said. It's down 7% today, down about 8% year to date, and down 30% over the trailing 12 months. So not a great move there. Crystal, thanks so much for joining us. Crystal C, just giving us the update there. Carl Icahn settling what is for him, I'm sure, a very small number, a couple of $1 million to settle some issues with the SEC.
IEP.
Carl Icahn's 88 years old.
Icahn, he's in good shape for 88. That is still a very sharp guy.
Yep.
His company, this is a diversified holding company.
Right.
They hold automotive investments, energy, gaming, rail car, food packaging, markets, real estate, metals, home fashion.
Market cap, $7.5 billion. All right, we got an M&A trade here today, which I think hits near and dear to a lot of folks that are, particularly if you're 7-Eleven fans. I'm a Wawa guy myself.
Crystal covered that story as well this morning. 7-Eleven has the Icy, which I like, versus the Slurpee.
What's the Slurpee?
The Slurpee is, I think, grainier.
Okay.
The Icy is a lot smoother. Yep. And I'm a bigger fan of the Icy. Had one last night on my drive home from the great state of Ohio.
You were in Ohio?
Yeah.
What'd you drive?
I drove back in my Dodge Challenger RT Scat Pack wide body.
On I-80?
Yeah. That's a good cruiser.
Yeah, exactly. Diana Rosero Pena joins us here in our studio. She's a Bloomberg Intelligence consumer staples analyst. Who is Couche-Tard? And why are they buying 7-Eleven for $31 billion?
Well, Couche-Tard is the second largest convenience store in the United States. They manage Circle K. Yes.
Okay. But they're Canadian, and that's why they have a French name that sounds funny to American ears.
Yes. It took me actually a while to be able to pronounce their name. But yeah, so they're very acquisitive. We're not that surprised that they are, there's stocks that they want to buy something. But 7-Eleven is actually a big name. Yeah. There's valuations going from like $50 billion to as much as like $85 billion. So for them to be able to do that, it's quite impressive if they are able to.
It's always surprising, I think, to people who aren't in the know that 7-Eleven is owned by a Japanese holding company. And I think they own Speedway as well. These seem like such American brands. Yep. So does Circle K, and it's owned by a Canadian company. Is there going to be antitrust issues here
Well, for sure. The FTC, I mean, ask Kroger. They have been trying to purchase Albertsons for a couple of years now. So if they actually come up with the numbers and there's acceptance, I'm sure the FTC will have something to say. 7-Eleven has like about 14% of market share in the United States, whereas Couche-Tard with their Circle K brand, they have about 5%. So it definitely will be, up for.
Again, I'm a Wawa guy, but I can see.
Is Wawa just like a New Jersey thing?
No, but it is. What is it?
It's in the Northeast. There's mostly in the Northeast. So, but yeah,
Explain to me this convenience store business. What's the economics of a convenience store? I just see people going in and out all the time. What's the economics?
Well, basically, they want you to go in for your gas. They're very competitive in gas prices. Fuel margins have been improving in the past few years. Couche-Tard actually has about 40 cents per gallon in terms of fuel margins. But what they're making money on is when you go into the store, particularly if you buy their sandwiches, the margins for that is like 50%.
It's true. By the way, I was filling up on the way there and back for more than $4.50 a gallon.
Oh, because you're putting in the super duper high.
I go with 93.
Yeah.
And then I go in and I pick up a Snickers bar for my kid brother, and I got, I don't know, like a Twix. Each of those candy bars was more than $2.50.
Margin there.
And I'm starting to feel like a really old man, you know, because when I was a kid, 50 cents is what you paid for these things.
So are these good businesses? I mean,
yeah, if they're buying, I'm sure, they think that there's some good business. I mean, Couche-Tard has usually, they do big acquisitions. The last acquisition that they did was for $11 billion for the Total Energies in Europe. But they usually, in the U.S., they usually buy smaller operators. For example, also this morning they announced that they bought GetGo from Giant Eagle. So that's another convenience store which is in the
with the delicious pulled pork sandwich, by the way.
Oh well, I actually haven't tried it.
Yeah, I had one this weekend. Yeah.
Where's GetGo?
I had them in Pennsylvania.
Virginia. Yeah, it's regional. Yeah.
Okay. All right, it's the Midwest. It's part of the world I don't go to.
I skipped what's the one you like? The Cracker Barrel.
Cracker Barrel.
I declined.
But you probably drove past like 100 of them on the
Yes, a lot of them. And I used to always stop because you get a books on tape at one, and then you'd return it at the next. But you no longer.
What else are we seeing in your space, Diana, in the retail space? What are some of the key things people are looking at? Because you cover a lot of retail.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is like the biggest thing that has happened today.
It's one of the biggest deals of the year, right?
Well, yeah, even
$31
Kroger,
billion puts it like number 2.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the Kroger Albertsons acquisition is also the talk of the town. There's like likelihood that it might not happen. The FTC might object. So
when are we going to hear about that deal? Because we've been talking about Kroger's and Albertsons for a long time.
Yeah, honestly, like it really depends on what happens with the election and how M&A friendly the FTC will be afterwards.
All right. Well, 7-Eleven, by the numbers, and this is according to Bloomberg reporting, 85,000 stores. That's huge, and they've got 157,000 employees. So that's a big business.
Yeah.
And Couche-Tard Couche-Tard's got a bigger valuation, $58 billion valuation versus 38 for the 7-Eleven. So much higher valuation using that stock and cash, I guess, to get bigger.
Yeah, I think, definitely. I mean, obviously, I see this as an Asia play, to be honest with you.
Which we've seen more and more and more of, right? I mean,
yes.
If you look at activist investors involved in Japanese stocks, for example, it goes from 15 in 2022 to 25 last year to 28 so far this year, and we're only in the first half.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
I mean, 7-Eleven has like 31% of the Asia Pacific market share. So,
okay,
yeah.
Now we're talking.
We're talking.
Diana, thank you so much for joining us. Diana Rossetto Pena, another one I hired back today. She's blossomed into this great analyst. Very cool to see. Consumer staples analyst, Bloomberg Intelligence, joining us in the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, not mailing it in from like Nantucket or Deer Valley or wherever they are.
Me and Paul
like
do not support
management.
work from home.
Yeah, so BI management, we know what's going on. Diana, she comes into the office. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 11:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We do have the S&P holding close to session highs, up 21 right now, up 0.4%. Stocks higher for an 8th straight day. That is the longest winning streak of this year. Traders are hoping the Federal Reserve will signal it will soon kick off rate cuts. The Dow up 192 now for the Dow, a gain of 0.5%. NASDAQ up 56 for the NASDAQ Composite Index, an advance now of 0.3%. 10-year at 3.83%, the 2-year 4.05%. Gold down $3.50 the ounce to $25.04, down 0.1%. West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.2%, 76.46 a barrel. Bitcoin down now by 2%, 58,602 on Bitcoin. A source tells Bloomberg General Motors is cutting more than 1,000 software engineers as the automaker moves to lean up its software and services organization. More than 600 of those layoffs are said to be in Michigan. GM shares up now by 0.1%. Recapping stocks higher. S&P up 20, up 0.4%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pelleton, thank you so much. We appreciate that. As always, Matthew Miller sitting in for Alex Steele today in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. We're streaming live on YouTube as well, so head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Podcast, and that's where you will find us. As Charlie was just reporting, green on the screen today. Boy, that 2 weeks ago today, when we had that big sell-off and that VIX
Monday
jumping above 60. You know, we got the VIX back down below 15. It's just amazing the round trip we've had. So I don't know what to make of it, but I think our next guest might. Carol Schleif, Chief Investment Officer at BMO Family Office, joins us via that Zoom thing. Carol, what's your opinion on what we've seen over the past couple of weeks? Again, starting with 2 weeks ago today when we had that panic sell-off.
Yeah, it's not necessarily unusual for August to be exceedingly volatile. You've got a lot of senior people on the beach, and it can very frequently lead to some choppy trading like we saw. It was a little eye-popping back then, but having lived through the 1987 issue, which was October, but still did a Friday to Monday. If that Monday had been similar, it would have been down 9,000 points on the Dow, not just a mere 1,000.
That's great.
So, but it's not unusual at all to see that kind of volatility. I actually would have expected it to happen, to follow through for a few days, and I wouldn't write off that we're done seeing volatility, especially if we get into Friday and people don't like what Powell says in the speech, and or we're just in between earnings now. We're off a good earnings season. We don't have much going until the Fed meets again after this week in September. So,
well, we get the continuing claims out before that, and it seems like every little data point has become a big event for markets with, I guess, low volume. That's going to happen. But what could Powell say that would disappoint?
If he pushed off the likelihood of a September cut, because I think most of the expectations are you'll see a cut in September. The question is just how much. 25 basis points, 50 basis points. Will he be able to structure commentary that actually Fed policy currently is very restrictive given where the economic data is coming in? And yes, the Fed has made us all very data dependent and data watchers on every single point trying to figure out which way the Fed's going to go. But there is a rationale and an ability for the Fed to be able to say, hey, our policy is restrictive. We could actually chunk it down a time or two, and it wouldn't be indicative of a softening economy. You've also got some retail numbers coming out this week, which people will be watching closely. You had the biggest retailer report last week, and you've also got NVIDIA coming out, and if people don't like that they haven't knocked it out of the park over and above where the expectations are, you could see that volatility in the markets in the short run.
All right, Carol, we've done this round trip over the past couple of weeks. What do I do now in the equity markets?
Well, I think you stay invested. Hopefully you were invested through all of that and sat tight. We were advising clients. The interesting thing is if you had a diversified portfolio, even on that Friday and Monday that were very volatile, your bonds did well because the rates came down, so the bond prices went up. So you had that durability built into the portfolio. You also look more broadly at things that should benefit if the Fed does start to cut rates. Small caps should benefit, mid caps should benefit. Lots of different industries here in the U.S. should continue to benefit. And we do suspect that once those rates come down, you'll see consumers continue to spend because they're employed. You'll see businesses, we suspect, spend more than is expected right now. And maybe the biggest surprise out there is how low that 10-year yield is, because we suspect it'll drift higher over the intermediate and longer term.
All right, so once the Fed, I mean, I guess we're all on the same page that they are going to cut, and by 25 basis points. Do they continue to do that, Carol? Because we're growing still at 2.5+%, and unemployment, although it ticked up, is still only 4.3%, which is very low. Inflation is also well under 3% now, which is back to, well, less than even its historical average. So does the Fed really need to be moving interest rates around? Why don't they just hold tight so that they have more powder left if something bad happens?
They still have an incredible amount of powder. If you think through that, for 10 to 15 years, they had basically no powder because they were 0 to 0.5%. They're at 5.25%, 5.3% right now. And so they've got substantial policy room and still leaving policy room. Even if they brought it down 100 basis points over the next 6 months or so, you've still got room in there to be able to cut if things really did tail off. And the last thing they want to do is be caught behind the curve too, especially on that employment market, because you've seen the momentum tick up there. And granted, it's from people coming into the market. But one question you have for yourself is, are they coming into the market because of they're being pinched by inflation and really feel a need?
Carol, I know in your notes here, you've got industrials and materials as a couple sectors you're looking at. That's not very exciting. Why are you guys looking at that?
Well, the thing of it is, you look at the charts on some of those industrials and materials, and the charts actually look a lot like NVIDIA's chart does in terms of there's a lot of fiscal stimulus or a lot of fiscal spending plans still in the works. Much of that money has been allocated, but not necessarily spent. And a lot of that's not necessarily going to be pulled back. And the reindustrialization, the bringing manufacturing back to the United States, a lot of those plans are in process. They had to work through local permitting, and we don't think they're going to be turned back. You've also got infrastructure spend. So there's a lot of reasons to think through that. But you've also got the notion where if you go back and look over the last 20 or 30 years, the industrial component of the S&P has shrunk. And given the attention and the spending we're focusing on that sector, or those sectors, we expect you'll see them expand, and perhaps as a percentage of the S&P as well, as the leadership shifts to a more broad group of participating industries.
Carol, when you look at your portfolio, do you need to change anything if Donald Trump wins this election?
We're feeling pretty comfortable about where the portfolios are, and a lot of it would depend on if Mr. Trump wins the election and what does the composition of House and Senate look like. So there's a big piece of that, and we typically have always advised people not necessarily to trade on potential who wins, who doesn't. You know, the theory had been, for example, that energy stocks should do better under Trump presidency than a Biden presidency, but the opposite proved to be the fact. So building sturdy portfolios for intermediate and long-term investment always is the wise, and being able to adjust or tweak at the margins after we see what the outcome is. There we might make some adjustments, but most likely not, because we tend to build really sturdy portfolios and think the economy is going to do quite well under either president.
All right, Carol, thank you so much for joining us. As always, Carol Schleif, Chief Investment Officer for BMO Family Office. All right, Matt, we got you here. What are you driving these days?
Well, I had been driving last week a Jaguar F-Type with the supercharged 5-liter. It's a little bit long in the tooth because You know, they haven't redesigned it in years, and that power plant is one that, you know, the Range Rover doesn't even use anymore. Now that Range Rover shifted over to like a BMW style 4.4 liter super turbocharged V8.
Wow.
I still thought it was a fantastic ride, and maybe an underestimated vehicle in terms of its price. You can probably pick one up used for a lot cheaper than you could any of its competitors. So if you're looking for a convertible GT, that's it. Now, I did drive back to Ohio on Friday and back here to New York on Sunday in my Dodge Challenger.
Scat Pack.
This is a Scat Pack, so it's got the 6.4 liter V8,
Sure.
naturally aspirated.
Naturally aspirated.
And that is a cruiser.
Yeah.
I have to say, you know, it's very comfortable doing just low triple digits on the Pennsylvania Turnpike all the way to Ohio.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So you made it there in no time. So just.
I made it there in less than 8 hours of total driving time. Now, I had to stop, obviously. There's some important places that you need to go. Cabela's, for example.
Yep.
Nothing like that around here. So, yeah.
But driving with family, you wouldn't do it in 8 hours.
No, no. I would have had to make a lot more stops than that.
Very good. 100 miles on the turnpike, no problem there with the Scat Pack,
People
whatever it is.
are cruising at generally like 85. So if you're doing like 95 to 100, you're not that much faster than the pack.
I tell you, my BMW X3, I'm shocked. Sometimes I look down at the speedometer, I'm going 86. I'm like, holy cow, it doesn't feel like that.
Yeah, we really need to up the speed limits in this country.
No, we get
It's
too
so
many
silly
knucklehead-
to have
we
them
got too many knucklehead drivers
low,
out there.
or any speed limits. You know what happened to freedom?
You're the libertarian, I know. You go to the Autobahn. With our news in New York City, here's Michael Barr.
Thank you very much, Paul, Matt, and Charlie. The Democratic National Convention opens today. The 4-day gathering in Chicago is designed to strengthen Vice President Kamala Harris as President Joe Biden's replacement. Biden will give the keynote address tonight. Bloomberg's Laura Davison has more from the Windy City.
It will be sort of a look back, a legacy-defining speech for him. You know, of course, just a month ago, this whole week was supposed to be a party for him, and now he's the speaker on the first night, and then we'll be departing the event to shift the attention onto Kamala Harris and Tim Walz and sort of the next direction for the Democratic Party. So this is a real change in vibe. You know, the organizers of the event said that there's been much more demand in the past month, both from media, from attendees, as well as celebrities who are expected to attend the event.
Bloomberg's Laura Davison at the DNC in Chicago. Meanwhile, hundreds of Republicans held a rally at a fairground in the northwest suburbs of Chicago. Pastor Corey Brooks attended the pro-Trump rally in Woodstock, Illinois.
It's our opportunity to stand for the principles and policies that we believe will make America better.
And Donald Trump this week will see him visit the U.S.-Mexico border and hold rallies in 4 key swing states. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the time is now to conclude a Gaza ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas.
I'm here as part of an intensive diplomatic effort on President Biden's instructions to try to get this agreement to the line and ultimately over the line. It is time for it to get done.
Blinken spoke in Tel Aviv and also in Jerusalem. TV talk show pioneer Phil Donahue has died. Donahue's family said in a statement to NBC News that he passed away at home surrounded by family, including his wife, Marlo Thomas. Phil Donahue was 88. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it. With the Bloomberg News Now, I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 11:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. I'm Charlie Pellet. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all in the green, very close to session highs. 23-point advance right now on the S&P, back at 55.77, a gain of 0.4%. We've got the Dow up 194, up 0.5%. NASDAQ up 71, up 0.4. The Russell 2000 advancing today by 0.8%. Stocks higher for an 8th straight day, the longest winning streak of the year. Traders hoping the Federal Reserve will signal it is ready to start cutting rates. 10-year yield 3.87%, the 2-year 4.05%. Gold down 0.3%, $2,500 even an ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.7%, 76.08 a barrel. And Bitcoin now lower by 1.8%, 58,720. Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City holds its Jackson Hole Economic Symposium later this week amid signals and speculation that the central bank will soon be cutting rates. With more, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
In the build-up to the week's big event, the president of the Minneapolis Fed signaled he'd be open to easing at the Fed September policy meeting. Neil Kashkari, speaking in an interview with the Wall Street Journal, cited the health of the U.S. labor market. The U.S. unemployment rate has been creeping higher. Meantime, looking at Jackson Hole, Bloomberg Economics sees Fed Chair Jerome Powell declaring it will soon be appropriate to cut rates. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
Billionaire Carl Icahn and his investment firm have agreed to pay $2 million to settle with the SEC after an investigation by the regulator. Shares of IEP, that is Icahn Enterprises, trading lower by 1.1%. Again, recapping stocks higher, S&P up 0.4. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate it. We've got Matthew Miller sitting in for Alex Steele here. I'm Paul Sweeney. We're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. We're streaming live on YouTube, so head over to youtube.com, search Bloomberg Podcast, and that's where you will find us. Matt, you want to talk about EVs?
I would love to, yeah.
Okay, it's great timing that you're here, because today we're going to talk a little bit about EVs with our good friend Corey Cantor. He's a lead U.S. electric vehicle analyst. Yes, there is such a thing at Bloomberg and New Energy Finance. They prefer BNEF. I don't care. He joins us here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Corey, give us a state of the market these days about where we are in this long evolution from, internal combustion engines to getting to an all-electric world. Where kind of are we on that spectrum today?
Yeah, we're in 2024. We're in a bit of, I'd say, a bumpy moment, a bumpy first half of the year. If we step back and look at 2023 compared to 2022, you saw in the U.S. about 50% year-on-year growth for electric vehicles in the U.S. First half of this year, you're looking more at that kind of 10 to 15%, depending on where you get your numbers.
Wait, we were 50% growth last year, and we're 15% this year?
So, Matt, basically, if you take out the largest automaker, Tesla, which has had a very difficult first half of this year, you're still seeing amongst the automakers, your Hyundai, your Ford, 30-40% year-on-year growth, more in the trajectory of what we saw last year. But Tesla's stagnation and kind of, I'd say, aging lineup has brought down that U.S. average more to that kind of 10 to 20%.
Well, and Elon Musk's pandering love for Donald Trump. Did you listen to that interview the other day? I think interview is the wrong word. Did you listen to that? Conversation? I mean, it was pretty crazy. Trump was like, you make great cars, but we don't all need electric vehicles. And Musk didn't even really go up against him.
I saw some clips from the conversation. I think less of the overall listening on. I'm on Twitter maybe too much, but more for sports and less for Spaces. With Tesla in particular, there's been some challenges in California, as Bloomberg News' own Dana Hull has covered. You've seen quarter-on-quarter reduction of overall sales compared to the previous year. So Tesla may have a California problem. Actually, my sister just got a Tesla Model Y, which continues to be the best-selling vehicle amongst EVs.
Ed Ludlow just got one, the co-host of Bloomberg Technology. I mean, Marion just got one, who runs the makeup room back here. It's a hot vehicle in terms of sales, right? But it's not, I guess, helping the overall number.
It's also they haven't released a new vehicle, excluding the Cybertruck, which has had very limited production, and all of those vehicles over $100,000. The kind of expected, more affordable Tesla, which, you know, if you talked to me a year ago, we would have expected in 2025, has been kicked back to, you know, a couple years afterwards. Tesla is aiming to introduce some low-cost models, but I think just like anything Tesla, it's a moving target.
It's pretty low cost. You can get into a Model Y, I think after all rebates are said and done, for about 34 grand, which, you know, it's not less than 30. I know that's where they want to go, but it's near as damn it to it. It's a problem, though, when the governor of California asks people, please not to charge your electric vehicles because the grid can't handle it, right? I mean, can we really get much bigger if we're already warning people not to charge?
I think on the, you know, it's going to continue to be, I think, a challenge for electric vehicles in this particular year. That being said, California's added a lot of battery storage, right? And if you look at how they're handling their grid, it's completely different than 3-4 years ago. Utilities have to get more, I think, structured. I'm more concerned about EV charging on the public side compared to the V2G element of it. But so goes California, so goes the nation. They've also had a stagnation there, around 25% EV share of sale in the first half of this year. That's pretty much where they were at the end of last year.
It's really high.
Yeah, it is high.
Are we seeing more chargers put in? I live in Scarsdale, and I've had problems with multiple EV charging stations, either broken or too full. It would make sense to me for every gas station owner to just put in a couple chargers, but they don't seem to be doing it.
There is a challenge with what's called demand charges, which is them pulling from the grid. It may theoretically sound like a great idea, but if you're adding for those grid upgrades and those additional costs, it might not be worth it for the gas station operator. I think the good news is a lot of the federal money hasn't been spent. I think there's been a misconception that, you know, the $5 billion in the National EV Infrastructure Program has actually gone out. It's gone to states, and they have to actually begin to deploy those chargers. So it's still moving too slow. You know, Matt, in terms of the consumer, they want to see a charging network that they feel comfortable with. And until you get to that point, you can hardly say that it's going well enough. You're also seeing this kind of NACS, North American Charging Standard transition, the Tesla supercharging network that has also been stymied by all the firings of that supercharging team. So it's messy and bumpy here in the U.S. I think in terms of good news, we can point at the Inflation Reduction Act investments beginning to actually come online and bear fruit, if we want to talk about that too.
Samantha writes in and says, is hybrid the way to go?
Ooh, okay. Well, hybrids have done well in the first half of this year. You're looking at Toyota even aiming to go at full hybrid. I think plug-in hybrids have maybe been overhyped in terms of the kind of focus and attention. That's when you have both the battery electric engine and the kind of gas engine. There's not too many models besides the Jeep Wrangler PHEV that does well. So wait and see. I think both BEV and hybrid are going to play a major role in the U.S. market going forward. I think with plug-in hybrids, you need them to get a lot better. I mean,
my wife had the Volvo XC90 T8 plug-in hybrid for 2 years.
Doesn't have any more?
That was a lease, and we got out of that lease, but she loved it because for the most part, she was just around town on electric power the whole time. In fact, in the first year that we had the car, she only filled it up with gas twice.
Yeah, that's pretty remarkable.
But is that like a niche use case? Or, I mean, I feel like there's a lot of suburban...
That's probably the idealized use case, right, of a smart PHEV driver. And I think when we've done our reports and analysis on PHEVs, just as you have the more savvy BEV drivers, battery electric vehicle drivers, to, you know, the more mass market, it doesn't mean that future PHEV drivers would drive that way. They might just say, oh, we're going to fill it up with gas because we're used to it with the hybrid experience. What we want to see more of is in China, the all-electric mode is about twice the volume-weighted average all-electric mode here in the U.S. So you want to see more of those kind of like Toyota PHEV range, 50 miles, 40 miles, less of this like 18, because then are you really going to fill it up on electric?
My favorite hybrid that I've test-driven recently for my podcast, which is called Hot Pursuit.
Exactly.
You can download that on Bloomberg.com or wherever you get your podcasts,
of course.
I drove the Corvette E-Ray.
Really?
Which has the 6.2-liter V8 behind you and an electric motor on the front axle. And that eliminates any kind of lag that you might get, like 0 to 10. So as a result, 655 horsepower, 0 to 60 in 2.5 seconds.
Wow, and how often do you need to do that, of course? Corey Cantor, thanks so much for joining us. Corey Cantor, lead U.S. electric vehicle analyst at BNEF. He's still talking, I'm not going there, but, you know, these guys can go out and talk about it all they want, you know, but maybe I'll go hybrid at some point.
I think it's the way to go. I think it's the way forward for now until we deal with the grid and the charging issues.
All right.
You know, depends on your specific use case.
So you're not driving the Volvo anymore?
No, we switched over to. I wish we'd kept it. I'm a little bit disappointed.
All right, we'll figure that out. S&P 500 up 0.4%. Same for the Dow. Same for NASDAQ. This is Bloomberg.
company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Sources tell Bloomberg British tech entrepreneur Mike Lynch, the former CEO of software firm Autonomy, is among the people missing after a super yacht sank off the coast of Sicily. Italy's Coast Guard is leading search and rescue operations and has recovered 15 people. Lynch is best known for selling his company Autonomy to Hewlett-Packard for more than $11 billion in 2011, the largest ever takeover of a British business at the time. Estee Lauder CEO Fabrizio Freda plans to retire at the end of June 2025, capping a decade-and-a-half reign that transformed the company into a global cosmetics giant, but ran into trouble in recent years. AMD Advanced Micro Devices is buying server maker ZT Systems in a cash and stock transaction valued at $4.9 billion. And with more, here's Bloomberg's Kimberly Adams.
Charlie, ZT Systems is based in Secaucus, New Jersey, and it will become part of AMD's Data Center Solutions business group. AMD will retain the business's design and customer teams and look to sell the manufacturing division. The deal price includes a contingent payment of $400 million based on certain milestones. Closely held ZT has extensive experience making server computers for owners of larger data centers, the kind of customers that are pouring billions into artificial intelligence capabilities. Charlie?
And that's Kimberly Adams reporting. reporting shares of Advanced Micro Devices advancing now by 3.6%. Palo Alto Networks will be among the names reporting today after the close of trading. Its shares have been on a tear over the last 2 weeks. Palo Alto Networks trading higher now ahead of earnings, up by 2%. Those are our top company stories at this hour. I'm Charlie Pelletan. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, we've got some green on the screen here. S&P 500 up about 0.5%. Same for the Dow, same for NASDAQ. Yields steady as well here. This is a summer day for sure. In August, 3.85% is the yield on your 10-year. You want to go a little bit shorter on the 2-year on your government's 4.05%. With our news in New York City, here's Michael Barr.
Thank you very much, Paul. Matt, Charlie, the Democratic National Convention kicks off today in Chicago. President Joe Biden speaks tonight. Vice President Kamala Harris heads into the convention with a 4-point lead over former President Trump among registered voters in an ABC Washington Post Ipsos poll. Bloomberg's Laura Davison is covering the DNC in Chicago.
She has the spotlight on her naturally this week. I mean, there's lots of press here. They have, basically 4 nights of primetime programming happening, as well as a bunch of events happening on the sidelines of the convention, starting from basically 7:30 in the morning till almost midnight at night, with Democratic surrogates who will be out and about. So she will have sort of the natural edge going into the week. However, Trump is not willing to cede the spotlight.
Bloomberg's Laura Davison reports Trump is planning events in 4 swing states during the 4 days of the convention, starting today with a rally in Pennsylvania. He'll head to the border in Arizona on Thursday, the day Vice President Harris accepts the nomination. Ousted Representative George Santos is expected to plead guilty today to multiple felony counts. The New York Republican is charged with nearly 24 counts, including wire fraud, money laundering, and theft of public funds. Flooding hit the Northeast after heavy rain swamped the area. In western Connecticut, streets and sidewalks were suddenly overwhelmed by water moving fast enough to carry away cars. Monroe, Connecticut Police Chief Keith White says parts of Route 34, a major commuter road, have been heavily damaged.
The one bridge that I'm referring to our east is completely gone. There's nothing left to the short bridge, just short of the Stevenson Dam.
Crews recovered the body of one woman and are looking for a second. Finally, talk show host, pioneer Phil Donahue has died.
Thanks very much, Delani Barbach, PhD, University of California. The book is titled Shared Intimacies. I'm glad you were with us and hope you have a nice day.
Donahue was the husband of Marlo Thomas. His family said he'd been suffering from a long illness. Phil Donahue was 88. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Paul, Matt, Charlie.
All right, Michael Barr, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Matt, can you explain to our audience what the Concours d'Elegance is in Pebble Beach?
I can. It is basically a classic car show and probably the most important classic car show in the world. It is the, I guess, really the most important event of Monterey Car Week, which is not all in Monterey. Some of it's in Pebble Beach, some of it's in Carmel, right? But they have become probably the most important car show alongside CES in Las Vegas, which also isn't really a car show.
Right, exactly.
But it's no longer kind of the Detroit Car Show or the Geneva Car Show. It's Monterey Car Week and CES that are really the key events. So you'll have a lot of car companies, almost all of them, introducing new models at the Quail first on Friday. And then the classic cars are shown in the Concours d'Elegance on Sunday. And it's really a spectacular event. I mean, I imagine you've been to it numerous times.
Many times. They come up the main street, Ocean Avenue in Carmel, and we all sit out there on lawn chairs and watch all the cars come up on Tuesday of the week. So it concluded yesterday, and I'm guessing some big sales of some really expensive cars.
Yeah, there are always huge sales, and we've seen the average auction price go up and up and up. I think last year, the average auction price was $916,000, and it's important to remember that includes cheap cars.
Right.
So, but obviously, it's the big Ferraris that usually push the price higher. It used to be the pre-war cars that were the big money spinners. Now the average age of cars is getting younger and younger. So, for example, 10 years ago it was 1964, the average age of an auction car. This year it's 1971.
All right, interesting. Some good stuff out there in the Monterey Bay Peninsula. Good stuff out there if you're a car fan. All right, coming up, Balance of Power, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons. That is coming up next. They are live from the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. That program starts right now.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power.
From the Democratic National Convention in Chicago to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power alongside Kaylee Lyons. I'm Joe Matthew. Kaylee, you've made it to Chicago. A month after the Republicans wrapped their convention in Milwaukee. It's day one here in Chicago, and we've got some great guests and important voices teed up for the next 2 hours to get us ready, Kaylee, for the first night.
Indeed, it's going to be a big one. It also comes a month after President Joe Biden left this race, decided not to seek re-election and hand the reins over to his Vice President Kamala Harris, who already is officially the Democratic nominee after a virtual roll call earlier this month.
Yes, indeed.
But the formalities and the pomp and circumstance happen here in Chicago this week. And of course, she will wrap things up, giving that acceptance speech on Thursday. It is President Biden we will hear from in prime time tonight.
That's the big one. President Biden here in town. The First Lady Jill Biden will also be speaking. And the theme, Kaylee, we've got, of course, a different theme for each night. For the people, which is right up Joe Biden's alley when it comes to his own branding. The former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton will also be at the podium tonight as well.
Yeah, many speeches to watch. We're also, of course, watching here in Chicago for potential protests. We've already seen some yesterday. And the question is going to be, to what extent could they actually disrupt the activities today? Obviously, much preparation has been done from a security standpoint. And of course, Democrats are really going to be trying to project a message of unity, even if there are some divisions evident over the ongoing war.
Yeah, we're talking tens of thousands, potentially, we've heard, at least, of protesters. We saw some gatherings last night around Michigan Avenue and some other areas close to where we're all staying, but unclear the scale to which these protests will take. We know there are 30 uncommitted delegates on the floor, pro-Palestinian delegates, ceasefire delegates, as they've been called. But the logistics, the security surrounding this event couldn't be more complicated, and that's where we start our conversation with Bloomberg's Isis Almeida, who is our Chicago bureau chief here at Bloomberg. Isis, great to see you. Thanks for having us in your hometown.
Thank you for having me.
This has been quite the operation to secure this convention. What are we in for the next several days?
Yes, I think the city's been preparing for like over a year. Chicago police is getting help from about 500 police officers from other parts of the country too. I think there's 150 National Guard on standby. Pritzker confirmed that yesterday, just in case we need it. We've seen the first protests. There's at least 7 scheduled that we know of, and I'm sure many more will come and pop up once in a while. And you know, will just be interesting to see how they can disrupt the mood or how the city of Chicago keeps everyone under control.
Well, and it's been especially remarkable because the city of Chicago has hosted a convention before, including in 1968. And that's what everyone seems to be drawing a comparison to as we come in to this week. But obviously, Chicago very much wanted to host this. This was a big effort on the part of Governor Pritzker, who you just mentioned. What does this mean for the city, especially if things potentially go awry or we start to actually see protests turning violent?
Yes, I think for the governor, really, this convention is what propels him to the national stage, right? If you think about, like, a lot of people don't know who he is, and I think after this week, everyone will know who he is. So keeping things under control and making sure that we don't look like 1968, where we had severe clashes between the police and protesters, and the police pretty much crushed the protesters. I think that will be very, very important for the governor and his image. So I think they will try everything they can to ensure that things go peacefully.
Interesting that we've heard from police on that front that even non-permitted protesters will not be rounded up, will not be arrested as they try to avoid massive engagements with protesters. We're not going to see hundreds or thousands of people rounded up. Is that fair to say?
I think if things remain peaceful, I definitely think we won't see that. But I think Chief Snelling, who is our chief of police here in Chicago, he made it clear he will not let protesters destroy the city.
And of course, it's not just going to be protesters that are here in town. There's thousands of people who have descended for the convention. Obviously, this is a big event for a city hosting. What kind of economic impact do we expect that this is going to have for Chicago?
I think this is a really interesting question because the economic impact that has been forecast is about 150 to 200 million. But when you start talking to restaurants and you see that maybe the number of like Chicago residents that have chosen to stay away from the city are actually impacting their reservations. So they're not really seeing a boom in restaurant bookings as a result. It was funny when I drove in today, there was no traffic. And I was like, wow, this is the first day of, in weeks that there's no traffic on the highway.
Not too used to that around here, but that is what this is all about, right? There's a reason why a city vies for an opportunity like this to get the eyes of the nation, get the eyes of the world on Chicago, and maybe change the narrative. Donald Trump spent time in Milwaukee comparing Chicago to Afghanistan, referring to some of the crime statistics. This is a chance for Chicago to turn that story around, right?
Yeah, I think Chicago, even before the convention, already had issues with like persistently high crime. We've seen some high-profile businesses leaving the city, and I think that has really created that national narrative and the way people perceive Chicago. So I think it's a chance for the city to try to turn that around, and it will be important for them to keep things under control. But I think long-term, the city needs to continue to tackle crime if it is to attract businesses here.
Well, and tackling crime is obviously something that presidential candidates are talking about as well. Certainly Kamala Harris has been attacked by Donald Trump on the crime issue in addition to the economy and the border. Can you just give us a sense, Isis? Obviously, we are sitting here in a deep blue state. This is not a swing state where this convention is being held, as was the case in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But what are the issues that resonate with voters, not just in Chicago, but in Illinois in general?
Yeah, I think the biggest concerns that we see here, we see the pro-Palestine concerns, and this is why you have the protests. You see a lot of like women's rights, reproductive rights, LGBTQ plus rights, and that is something that a lot of people in the state are concerned about. I think the migration issue too, immigration, and you've seen the number of like people, more than 40,000 people have arrived in Chicago from Texas and other parts of the country bused here, and I think there's a lot of tension between the Chicago Black population and the immigrants that are coming, and where the city spends its resources. And there's a lot of money that's gone to sheltering the migrants, while there's already a Black homeless population in the city. So those are tensions that we've seen played out in City Hall.
All right, Isis Almeida, it's going to be a busy week for you, playing host to all of us this week. She is our Chicago bureau chief. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, Joe and I are now here in Chicago. Both President Biden and Kamala Harris are now here as well, although Biden is going to be leaving after his speech tonight, heading out to California. He won't be staying through the week. But we also saw the presidential candidates, including Vice President Harris, on the move this weekend as they competed in swing states. Harris and Walz on a bus tour of Pennsylvania yesterday, and of course Donald Trump holding some rallies of his own.
Yeah, not an accident where they're positioning themselves. And we're going to see actually Donald Trump and J.D. Vance kind of counter-programming what Democrats are doing throughout the week. Not exactly what we saw in Milwaukee, but this is what they're dealing with right now, with new polls showing once again that Kamala Harris has the momentum, and you can't stay home if you're Donald Trump.
Yeah, definitely trying to stall that momentum to the extent that he can. But we should just take a listen to some of the language we were hearing from both of these candidates this weekend as they looked ahead to this week.
I very much consider us the underdog. We have a lot of work to do to earn the vote of the American people. That's why we're on this bus tour today, and we're going to be traveling this country as we've been, and talking with folks, listening to folks, and hopefully earning their votes over the next 79 days.
Who would believe this? 80 days from now, we are going to defeat a communist known as Kamala Harris. She's a communist. Most radical left person ever to run for office. This is not what this country needs. We've had enough of them. We're going to win back the White House, and we're going to take back our country.
Anybody who's about beating down other people is a coward. This is what strength looks like. So we know what we are about. We know what we stand for. And one of the beautiful things about these next 79 days is what the people in this room have already been doing and know.
let's build community. Let's reinforce community.
I'm a better looking person than Kamala. No, I couldn't believe it. She said, you know, I had never heard that one. They said, no, her biggest advantage is that she's a beautiful woman. I'm going, huh. I never thought of that. I'm better looking than she is.
So that was a look back at this past weekend. Now we look forward to what's to come for the remainder of the week here at the Democratic National Convention. And as we do so, joining us here on set in Chicago is Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger of Virginia. Congresswoman, thank you so much for being with us. Happy convention week to you. Obviously, you and your party are coming into this week with, I think, can be fairly characterized as a great deal of enthusiasm over the new candidate 4 weeks in to her campaign. The question has been, how does that momentum be sustained after this week? What does the party need to do in the coming days here in Chicago to keep this going until the election?
Well, I think importantly, what we're doing back home in Virginia is making a pitch to voters about what's on the line with this election, what matters, why people need to get out and vote. And what I expect to occur is coming out of this convention, the continued conversation about the stakes of this election, the choice that we have certainly at the presidential and vice presidential level, but even at the Senate level. In Virginia, we have Senator Tim Kaine up for re-election, and at the congressional level, where we have some incumbents running for re-election as well as some challengers. And so that momentum, I think, will continue. We've had more than a 500% increase in volunteer signups back home in the Commonwealth. So it's an exciting time, but it's because people know what's at stake.
Each member of the party, certainly every lawmaker coming to town here, is coming with a different set of issues, a different set of values, you might suggest. And in Virginia, it's interesting, as you butt up against the capital city, you have a massive federal workforce working in your state, whose jobs could be on the line depending on the outcome of this election.
That's exactly right. And we have seen through Agenda 2025, through Agenda 47, or Project 2025 and Agenda 47, we know that there are major shifts that President Trump and a Vice President Vance would make to the federal workforce. Vance himself said that his advice would be to fire every federal worker and replace them with, quote, our people. So the stakes of this election are dire for so many Virginians, and certainly the federal workforce, the very function of government, but the Virginia economy. And so it's something that we're talking about across the Commonwealth, the reality that when you have a presidential and vice presidential candidate who wants to do away with those jobs, those livelihoods, that's a major risk, certainly to those individuals, to their lives, to their jobs, but also to our economy.
Well, certainly we've all paid attention to what Trump and the Trump-Vance ticket broadly have outlined in terms of what they'd like to see with their domestic agenda. There's also the foreign policy agenda. We know, for example, Senator Vance is highly skeptical of continuing to help fund Ukraine and its effort against Russia. Certainly there is some contrast between these two tickets when it comes to the issue of Israel and Gaza, something we expect to be fully on display here in Chicago with protests. Given your seat on the Intelligence Committee, your background at the CIA, how should we be thinking about the foreign policy implications of this election?
The foreign policy implications of this election are extraordinary. And I say that as a current member of Congress, as you mentioned, a member of the Intelligence Committee, but also as a former national security professional, as a CIA officer. The things that J.D. Vance has said about our support to the Ukrainians, I think just discounts the entire importance and value of American global leadership, of our commitment to our NATO allies. Certainly we saw under President Trump's first presidential term his constant alienating of our allies, his efforts to pull us away from NATO, which is an extraordinarily important alliance. And the contrast is clear. And a Trump-Vance administration would imperil our national security, would imperil our position of global leadership, and from a national security perspective, I think would be a dire circumstance, particularly as we see on the ground in Ukraine, the Ukrainians fighting for their freedom, and we see commitment to the cause of democracy worldwide under threat.
Remember the race in 2008, Hillary Clinton famously had the 3 a.m. call ad. You know, is your commander-in-chief going to be ready when the phone rings at 3 a.m.? She was referring to her experience at the time, and of course then became Secretary of State in another career. When we consider the stakes in this election, after everything that you just said, why is Kamala Harris ready for that phone call at 3 a.m.? What experience brings her to that point?
Well, importantly, she spent time as a member of the United States Senate on the Senate Intelligence Committee. So recognizing the breadth and the scope of information coming in from the intelligence community, from the extraordinary individuals working the world over to help policymakers make informed decisions. I'm proud I used to be one of those folks, and now I'm on the policymaking side. So in that role, she knows the full scope of what comes before policymakers. As vice president, she has had a seat in the room at every major decision, whether it was sharing initial intelligence related to our knowledge that the Russians were going to invade Ukraine, or anything across the board. Since that war began, she has been part of the decisions being made. She has been in the room, and she knows the reality and the dire consequences of each situation and what the American response needs to be and has been.
And finally, Congresswoman, before we let you go, this election also will, of course, mark the last one you are in as a sitting member of Congress. You are not seeking re-election to that body, instead pursuing the governor of Virginia. Before you go, though, knowing we're going to be in full election cycle mode, maybe not a lot's going to happen between now, maybe the lame duck session. I know there's some things you want to get done, including the Stock Act, restrictions on trading for members. Are you confident you can get that done before you leave the chamber?
Oh, so it's a busy time on Capitol Hill.
Sure.
And the Trust in Congress Act, which is the one that would put restrictions on members of Congress from being able to buy or sell individual stocks, right, is so vitally important, because when we think over the past number of years, the degradation of trust that people have had, the low approval rating of Congress, our ability to say, when we are here, every decision we make is a decision we are making because it is one that is informed by information, by intelligence, by conversations we're having with experts in certain fields, and not by how we might benefit or our stock portfolio might benefit. In terms of how confident I am, the bill is wholly bipartisan. We've got folks across the political spectrum supporting it because it just makes sense. It's wildly popular with the American people. And I ultimately will continue to push for Speaker Johnson to bring that bill for a vote. But I am tempering my enthusiasm on our ability to get it through, but I will say that I have already lined up my successor to carry it on. If we do not get it this Congress, I promise you we will continue to have an aggressive effort to get it done.
And it would stand a better chance in a Democratic House?
I would hope so.
Okay. Congresswoman, great to see you in Chicago. Thanks for starting your day with us here on Bloomberg. Abigail Spanberger of Virginia. As we get things started here, special coverage from Chicago. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons. It's day one of the Democratic National Convention. And Kaylee, coming up, we'll sit down with a local. Congressman Jonathan Jackson of Illinois will be with us right here on set to carry on our conversation.
Indeed, we're looking forward to that one, and we have much more coming up throughout the course of the next several hours here on Bloomberg TV and radio, live from the DNC in Chicago. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, live from the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew as the DNC week kicks off. Of course, 4 days, 4 nights, Joe, of pomp and circumstance, enthusiasm in the Democratic Party, and it begins tonight with the primetime speech from President Joe Biden, who, of course, just 4 weeks ago decided this would not be his convention. Instead, it's the convention of his vice president, Kamala Harris.
That's right. He's the headliner instead of on the fourth night. On the first night, First Lady Jill Biden will be speaking as well. Kaylee, there's been a lot of references to passing the baton, and that's actually what is going to happen. We saw Kamala Harris and Joe Biden on stage for the first time last week, as we brought to our listeners and viewers live for the first time since Joe Biden dropped out. But this is the big moment tonight, as he looks ahead to the future in a theme for the people on night one of the DNC. And joining us now is Congressman Jonathan Jackson of Illinois. We thought we'd bring someone actually from Chicago. It's great to see you, sir. Thanks for being here at the table. Nice to see you in your hometown.
Great to see you again.
Is this a good night or a bad night for Joe Biden?
It's a great night. President Biden has so much to be proud of. He's honored his word to the African-American community. He was the first president to actually interview an African-American woman to go to the Supreme Court. He's put an African-American woman on the Supreme Court. He also had an African-American as his vice president, and he has now made her his successor that he has endorsed. President Joe Biden has fully funded the EPA. He's done something record and historic in putting money into human infrastructure. The city of Chicago on the south and west sides has the largest amount of lead service lines in the nation. There is no safe amount of lead that you can have in your water. That's fully funded. So he's done so many remarkable things, and I think that that's going to be a hallmark of his legacy and the foundation that he's laid for a future generation.
Well, Congressman, you talk about ways in which he has elevated Black Americans to some of the most senior levels of the U.S. government across all of its branches. Yet what we saw was in his candidacy, at least this time around, he was struggling to galvanize that base of voters that had supported him in 2020. We're starting to see that change, at least polling indicates, with Vice President Harris. What do you expect that her candidacy is going to be able to do when it comes to Black voters, or just voters of color in general in this election? How have things changed over the last 4 weeks?
Well, I think that earlier, I believe there was a bit of fake news and people saying African-American men were looking at Donald Trump. Donald Trump is entertaining. He's like P.T. Barnum, so you'll listen to him. You'll cackle with him, but you don't take anything serious about him. African-American males know this is the same man that asked for the execution of the Central Park 5 young teenagers, and after they were found guilty, he still has not apologized to them. Like, something is very depraved about this man. This man was also accusing a victim of sexual assault. That we know better than that. But what Mr. Biden has done is offered a clear alternative. He asked for decency. He has restored that. And now what you see in Mrs. Harris, she knows the culture. She's been a part of it. She's a product. She's gone to historically Black college. She has made clear on her investments that she wants to make in the community, and she has galvanized it. We see continuity. We see legacy. We see tradition. And for that, we want to honor her and keep up the great work of the Biden-Harris administration.
Yet Congressman Donald Trump continues to question Kamala Harris's racial identity, suggesting that she's somehow not actually part of the Black community. What do you say to that?
Well, that's very much ignorant. That he should first look at American law. 1896 in Plessy versus Ferguson, there was a test on that, and it came out to say that if you have one drop of blood, you're the Negro by definition. It's the Negro rule. So he's very ignorant of a lot of things, and that's one thing that he should be ashamed of. She has, her father is of African descent. He's Jamaican. Her mother is of Indian descent. Like, I don't know what this guy gets off on, and nobody ever pushes back on him for the most outrageous thing that he says. Let's talk about something else he said. He says he's beautiful when he was out at the Mar-a-Lago Rim.
Yeah, better looking than she is.
He says that he's better looking than Vice President Harris. Who would ever believe that, okay? We should at least give the man a dog so that the dog can have an objective test. Like, nobody's ever called this man attractive, and from his behavior with women, he's been very aggressive. So, no, there's something fundamentally wrong. What man compares himself beauty-wise to a female? I think he's very misogynistic. You're going to see racism come out. As he gets ready for this debate on September 10th, he's going to have looming over his head a September 18th trial date, if you will, a sentencing date. He's under enormous pressure at 80 years of age for things that he's done, and I think all of this is going to make him have even more erratic behavior.
Well, certainly we have seen a great number of personal attacks from Trump against Kamala Harris, but we also have seen some more targeted attacks when it comes to specific issues like the border or the economy. He has been, along with J.D. Vance, suggesting that if she was really going to do something to be able to fight inflation on day one, her day one was 3.5 years ago. We've heard this repeatedly now. What is the answer to that? Why has she not been able to have more influence over that as vice president?
Well, I don't have the answer for that at this moment, but it's a very complex issue. One thing you have to do is stop what he was gearing up for on this massive deportation. That's inhumane. That's not who we are. And then his outrageous idea of building this border wall. That also hurts the ecosystem. Animals and other things have to go around there. Winds and birds have to go over there. What is ailing South America should be the question that he should be focused on. President Trump is a chronic complainer, whiner. As opposed to fixing the blame, he ought to be more mature and fix the problem. The problem is not at the Mexican border. The problem is in South and Central America. When we end up putting additional sanctions on Cuba, saying that they're a terrorist state where there is no credible evidence for that, that drove 500,000 people off of the island that then have to migrate. When they put additional sanctions on Venezuela, that took out another 3 to 5 million people that they had to migrate. So people are coming up the Pan American corridor to the city of Chicago. It's 2,499 miles from Caracas, Venezuela to Chicago, Illinois. You don't have to fly to Caracas, Venezuela. You don't have to take a boat to Caracas, Venezuela. People are walking up that corridor because we put sanctions. We need to normalize some of the relationships, not be so punitive. It is growing. 2/3 of our hemisphere is non-English speaking. They're in South America. They're poor, and they're trying to have economic stability. The new era of America should be looking at something fundamentally that transforms our Marshall Plan, where we're helping these countries invest in their water systems, helping them invest in their roadway. That's something America has proprietary technology in, and we can make and expand our markets. Same thing we did after World War II when we went into Europe. We can have that same formula, and do that in South and Central America and in Africa. I want to put Africa on there just for a moment because in the year 2050, just 25 years from now, which is something we should be talking about, in 25 years from now, 1 in 4 persons on planet Earth will be Africans. How are we aligning our interests and our future towards what's going to be 25% of the world's population?
Congressman, the border is a huge issue. So is the economy. We've talked a lot about inflation. We've talked a lot about the plans that we've at least been able to understand. I know that we need some details from both campaigns. But one of your most passionate issues has been expanding the child tax credit on Capitol Hill. That is something that Kamala Harris wants to expand to $6,000, the number we hear. But J.D. Vance is also calling for an expanded child tax credit. Do you worry that Democrats in Chicago vote for the Trump-Vance ticket because of what they're talking about here, what are essentially Democratic issues?
No, because what Mrs. Harris is doing is authentic. What J.D. Vance is doing is following. He's not leading the issue.
Yeah.
The second part, what J.D. Vance is doing, he doesn't think that every woman should have an equal right to vote. He thinks that women that have more children should have a higher level of right to vote versus women that have fewer votes. We've already been through that with African Americans being called 3/5 of a human being who should have which level of proportionality to vote. His ideas are antiquated. They're stale. They simply don't work. Mrs. Harris is an authentic description of a child tax credit. That which was passed by Congresswoman De Rosario ended up moving 500,000, 50% of our children out of poverty. It never should have been cut under the Trump administration.
I'd like to ask you as well, Congressman, because we are here in your hometown. There has been a lot of talk about 1968, also in Chicago. I think we all know how that went at a convention. And there are planned protests here for basically the duration of this week over the war Israel is still conducting against Hamas in Gaza. How concerned are you that we may see images like we saw 60 years ago, almost?
I don't think we'll see that. I think we have a mayor that came out of the organizing community and activist. He and I have been on many marches and demonstrations together. I'm glad that he's opened the city hall, the mayor's office, to talk to them. There are routes that are established in very high visible levels. So I am glad that he has opened the door. He's talked to them. He's not shunned them. He's not turned his back on them. And I also encourage demonstrations. I think it's a healthy part of our democracy. Young people are out there. They have a point of view. They're trying to build a future for their future together. And to the degree they raise their voice peacefully, that's a good thing. Unlike what you saw with Mr. Donald J. Trump going into the Capitol, not wanting to have a clear transfer of power and killing Officer Sicknick, and not having the decency to call Officer Sicknick's name, not having the decency to call the officers on Capitol Hill and apologize for those that have lost their lives and others that have committed suicide and others that have been beaten down. He's shown no respect. And now all the way up until the time of the Congressional Gold Medal, saying it doesn't have any merit, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. They're comparable medals. Something's wrong with the man. As he gets more desperate, as he sees the polling number goes away, he's concerned that somebody's called him Will. Well, you are weird. You never laugh. You wake up mad all day long. You probably sleep with a cliff, you know, a clenched fist. Something is fundamentally wrong with this man.
You're bringing a lot today, Congressman. The protesters outside are one thing. What do you tell the 30 or so delegates, I know it's not a very high number, who are calling themselves ceasefire delegates, who want to try to disrupt the proceedings on the floor of this convention?
I wouldn't know if they would be disruptors, but if they are dissenters and want to maintain that position, I can respect it. It's going to be over 2,000 delegates if 30's people that have applied and gotten on, and this is their petition. I think our 10 is big enough to hold together. Even you have never Trumpers. Some of them came around, and some of them have not come around. We've got some Republicans.
Some of them are here.
And some of those never Trumpers are here. So it'll never be a party that has everyone singing at the same page at the same time. But out of that, I respect their creativity and their differences, even if I don't necessarily agree with it.
Surely there is a right to freedom of speech in this country. There's also a right, of course, to freedom of the press, something Joe and I enjoy very much. We get to interview people like you. We have not yet, though, and many people haven't, had the pleasure of interviewing the vice president since she became the Democratic nominee. This is something that the Trump-Vance campaign is criticizing her heavily for. Is it time for her to do that? Should she be answering questions from the press? Should she be doing a sit-down interview, or is just doing these rallies and reading the teleprompter and giving the speech in Chicago this week?
Well, I think she's done so much more than that. She had a body of work that's very well recognized, and that was with the Biden-Harris administration. This was unprecedented in that the president decided to step out. First thing she had to do was go through all the mechanics and the legal work to transfer documents to be the nominee. Then she had to gather all the votes to secure the nomination. Same time, she had to vet out a vice president. They had to map out a strategy, get ready to culminate at the convention. Then I believe it's the time for her to articulate all of her positions. But right now, she's very much in sync with the Biden-Harris administration. There will be some changes, but fundamentally, she has a great platform. It'll have some more of her personality, but she has a great platform to run on.
That timeline you mentioned will culminate with a debate on September 10th. Will that debate decide the outcome of this election?
No, I don't think so. I expect this to get much more dirty, nastier, all that coming from Trump. He's talking about attacks. He's not talking about the agenda that he wants to go forward. He's painting this very morose and dark cloud. We're going to have the 1929, you're going back into the Great Depression. If I don't win, every time the market goes up, it's because of me. Anytime it went down, it's because of him. He's just blamed, and I think people are tired of his pettiness. They're tired of his whining. People want to go forward with a vision. I think America is much better than that, and I'm so excited. When I see women standing up, when I see Mr. Walsh coming from being a teacher and a coach, these are people that we recognize. Not all the power and people have to go to the most prestigious and elite schools. There are great American schools all over the country. This reaffirms that wherever you go, you get a good education, you can rise up to the highest levels of our office and lead the American people.
All right, Congressman, great to see you here in Chicago. Thank you so much for having us in town. Congressman Jonathan Jackson of Illinois, we appreciate your time, sir, joining us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. And of course, we have much more conversation about the convention and the state of the 2024 race still ahead. But as always here on Bloomberg, we also have to keep tabs on the financial markets. So let's get a check on that now with Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle in New York. Hey, Abby.
Hey, Kaylee and Joe. Well, it's interesting because we have stocks trading higher at this point, really at session highs after what had felt like a pretty sleepy session overnight. The S&P 500 E-mini futures basically up a little, down a little. Now, though, we do have the S&P 500 up closer to 0.5%, so a very solid gain, and very interesting, up an 8th day in a row, the longest winning streak going back to November of last year. So the best streak for stocks of this year after that bit of a sell-off. Now, beneath the surface, though, the volume is anemic, 30% below a recent average. That tells you that investors are still contending with a lot. One of them, of course, being uncertainty around election 2024. Another being the yen carry trade. We've heard so much about the unwind of the yen carry trade, whether there's more to go. Earlier today, the yen had been very strong, up more than 1%, which means that cheap money trade goes away. Now the yen off of those highs. We also have bonds rallying a little bit, which means yields are lower. That helps stocks. But at the end of the day, of course, it is DNC week, and I think, Joe and Kaylee, I finally put together a Harris trade because, of course, she outlined some policy last week, and this has to do with the idea that she's interested in perhaps capping grocery prices. So on the back of this, we do have Kroger lower, down 0.4%. At this point, Albertsons is a little bit higher, but also really interesting is the idea that she wants to create a $25,000 tax subsidy or subsidy for first-time home buyers. Meritage and D.H. Horton, those are home builders that really cater to first-time or new home builders. Those stocks up sharply. So the Harris trade, I would say, mainly today, really getting quite a lift.
Yeah, our campaign manager was mad.
Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle. Thank you so much, Abigail, for keeping tabs on the markets for us as we conduct our business here in Chicago, talking politics as usual, but a special brand. It's the DNC, a month after the RNC brought us to Milwaukee. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines here in Chicago as we assemble our panel as well. Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, is with us. Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. We made it, everybody. Nice to see you here for yet another convention. Jeannie, we just heard from Abigail Spanberger, Jonathan Jackson. This is a party very excited to be in this moment right now because it feels a lot different than it did a month ago.
It does. Somebody said this was going to be a wake, and now it is, to your point, Mardi Gras or a party. So I think that aptly, briefly describes how many Democrats feel. And, you know, there is a lot of work to be done here, but this is for the party a new generation, and it's something that they have wanted to put forward, and people on the ground are feeling good. But the polls are still close, so a lot of work to do.
I'm so glad you bring up polls, Jeannie, because that's exactly what I wanted to ask about. And I know before I say this that Rick is going to say it's a national poll, it doesn't count. But ABC, Washington Post, Ipsos, Harris 49, Trump 45, 4-point spread. Yes, this is national. We're dealing with a pretty wide margin of error here. But when you put that together with other polls that we have seen in swing states especially, it does look like Harris comes into this week with the wind at her back.
Yeah, I will concede that polling, especially national polling, can serve as a sort of a guide as to where things are going. It's a directional signal. And there's no question that the directional signals for Harris are all up, right? And whether it's tied or she's a little bit ahead, I think it's, you know, irrelevant right now, but clearly she's got momentum. She's got a week ahead of her where she gets to control the evening news. She gets to control the social media that's flowing out of here. And it should be another really good week for her. And I would say she hasn't lost a media cycle since she was announced as a presidential candidate. And that is extraordinary, to dominate the media against Donald Trump, who is a dominant media candidate. And so this is going to be a good week for her.
Pretty remarkable when you look inside this poll as well. The number on independents improving over Joe Biden. Independents supporting Kamala Harris by 8 points compared to just 2 for Joe Biden a month ago. Isn't that the story that she needs to be telling?
It is. And first of all, Kaylee, congratulations on getting him to concede about the national polls. We got to mark that. But it absolutely is. I mean, this is what they are working towards. One thing the Democrats have to be very careful about in this convention, and I think that they're cognizant of this, is that it doesn't become an Acela corridor convention where you have big Hollywood stars and people. I love the Excella corridor myself. I live on it, but it's got to be about these independents, moderates in these swing states. That's why we saw them yesterday in Pennsylvania. They're going to Wisconsin this week. And of course, Trump and Vance are spending a lot of time on the road as well, because everybody knows that this is about winning those independents. And the independents are feeling much better about saying, yeah, you know what, I'm going to look at Harris and I'm going to look at Waltz, because they weren't saying that when it was Joe Biden at the head of this race.
This is the last question I'll ask about this poll, at least for now. While it does have some good signs for Harris in it, on the economy and inflation, Trump is still leading her by 9 points in terms of who voters actually trust. She, of course, unveiled her economic platform in North Carolina on Friday, at least the broad strokes of it. We still have a lot of specifics I think us here at Bloomberg would prefer to have in hand at this time. Does she need to flesh that out a little bit more, or have other surrogates do it for her this week, considering it still is showing up as a weak point?
Yeah, I have a particular point of view on that. I think she should drop it immediately and never speak about it again, because it's a classic tax and spend Democratic philosophy. You know, we're going to raise taxes and we're going to spend it on things that we don't really have to spend it on. I mean, like trillions of dollars were announced on Thursday that the government doesn't have. And where's she going to get the money? It's going to be coming from your taxpayer dollars. And so I think that actually it was kind of a flop. I mean, the fact that we're talking about it today on the eve of her convention as like not having a lot of details, a lot of questions about where you're going to get the money, raising the deficit in a potentially inflationary period of time. These are all troubling things at a time when she is not winning the hearts and minds of voters on the economy. And then the other big issue, the second most important issue in most of the swing states, is immigration. And it's like the third rail for her. She can't touch it because she was once in charge of it, and now it's like something she can't talk about.
I want to talk about Joe Biden's job tonight and what we're going to see and hear. And I'm going to start by bringing us back a couple of years to 2020 and Joe Biden's acceptance speech at the last Democratic National Convention.
Here and now, I give you my word. If you entrust me with the presidency, I will draw on the best of us, not the worst. I will be an ally of the light, not the darkness. It's time for us, for we the people, to come together. And make no mistake, united we can and will overcome this season of darkness in America.
Fast forward to Chicago 2024, Jeannie. A lot has changed here, obviously. I started our conversation with Congressman Jackson by asking him if this is a good night or a bad night for Joe Biden. Could the answer be both?
I think it's going to be mixed feelings for him. You know, he has not famously missed a convention since the last 50 years, except for, I think, one in 1988 when he was ill. So he has been a huge part, obviously, of this party, has served in many capacities. And to your point, tonight is mixed feelings, I would assume. He thought he was going to be at the top of this ticket. He is saying, you know, farewell, move on, although he's still going to be serving as president. But you do hear him saying, and his associates saying, that the message tonight from him is going to be win. You've got to beat Donald Trump. So I think Joe Biden, having been through so many difficulties in his life, this is certainly mixed feelings, but I think overall he's going to be optimistic.
Reporting inside the White House is he's angry.
I think he does have
He feels betrayed.
I think he probably does have some resentment. He's also a political animal, and he too can see these polls that we've been talking about. He knows that this was the right move for the party and the country. And so I think as much as he's frustrated, he will, you know, reflect the fact Democrats have to move forward and move on. And he had a huge choice in bringing us to where we are with Kamala Harris.
Well, certainly Democrats will allow him the time tonight to reflect on his legacy and to celebrate the president he has been. Things move on very quickly. President Biden himself, after he gives this speech, is getting out of town, going on vacation with the First Lady to California. He is removing himself physically from the rest of this convention. Does the convention have to basically physically remove him from the conversation, or conversationally remove him for the remainder of it, and just focus on Harris from Tuesday morning onward?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. They have to do a hard pivot on Tuesday, and they've got Barack Obama to do it. So, like, what better person to change the story? Look, I mean, when I was running John McCain's campaign in 2008, we had an incredibly unpopular president, George Bush, who wanted to speak at the convention. Frankly, you have to do that. He wound up doing it because of different circumstances from the Oval Office, didn't even show up in town. And that was a good hard pivot for us, right? Get it on your candidate, not on the past, but in the future. And look, I think Jeannie's right. Joe Biden is a pro, right? He's been at this longer than anybody else we know. And he's not going to screw up tonight. But the tone tonight could really be important for getting this convention kicked off. And if he doesn't do a good job, and I think that's a coin flip, just, his ability to communicate is pretty, significantly deteriorated. And so, do you want to start the convention with that kind of tone?
It's a great point that Rick makes, which Joe Biden shows up tonight. We've had a chance to see.
Biden,
correct.
Debate Biden.
Or debate Biden. Are we going to have trouble understanding him? What would that do to this convention?
I think that would be troubling for all Americans. And so we hope that he is feeling well. He famously has said he wasn't feeling well at the debate. We've seen other moments like that.
Sure.
I would also say they're giving gift bags with a cup of Joe coffee, not our Joe, but the other Joe. And they have a quote from his Oval Office address stepping down, "History is in your hands." And I think that's what he's going to reflect. So hopefully he's well and he does the job that he's capable of doing. But I think that would be troubling for Democrats if he stumbles.
Well, something else that's remarkable is obviously the current incumbent Democratic president is going to speak, but we will also hear from two other former Democratic presidents, Barack Obama, as Rick mentioned, and Bill Clinton speaking this week. It does show that the people who have held the highest office, at least in the Democratic Party, are aligned behind Harris and still in the game. At the Republican convention, his vice president, formerly, Mike Pence, wasn't there. You didn't see George W. Bush there. Dick Cheney wasn't there. How important is it to have the other most elite of the party gathered here and having the backing of Harris?
I think it's critically important. It does show a difference to the Republican Party where they didn't have that show of unity. Democrats want to show unity in the convention hall, even though we have about 30 uncommitted delegates outside the convention hall with the protesters. So the support of Obama, Clinton, Carter's grandson, Hillary Clinton, a nominee who ran against Donald Trump and lost, that's all critically important to saying we support Kamala Harris and want to move forward.
When you consider the rhetorical balance for somebody who's run a convention, Rick, this new party platform that they'll be voting on here today mentions Donald Trump's name 150 times. Where is the balance between making this convention about Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, this platform, because platforms usually are the document to describe your party. And nowadays, it's the document to describe your opponent's party. And so I think the whole nature of a platform has changed. And frankly, unfortunately for Kamala Harris, because she needs a platform. Nobody really knows her that well. I know she's been vice president for 3.5 years, but the reality is she's introducing herself on Thursday night to the American public. More people will pay attention to her than ever before that night. And she doesn't have a party platform that's anything other than a political document to oppose Republicans. And so it's all up to her now. There's nothing to fall back on. There's no soft landing. And I think it's a huge mistake that parties make. Republicans did it 4 years ago. They didn't even have a platform, right? So the ideology was Donald Trump. There was no other ideology. And so I think that parties should actually reconsider the approach they're taking with these platforms and actually start to articulate what they're for and why.
Well, on the subject of articulating what you're for, we of course have seen in recent weeks Kamala Harris coming under immense criticism, especially from the Trump-Vance campaign for not making herself available to the press, not yet sitting down for a big interview. Meantime, the Trump campaign this week, as part of their counter-programming efforts, apparently are going to be including daily press conferences and conversations with the press. Jeannie, does it risk taking some oxygen away from Kamala Harris that she is not doing the same?
I think so. I think she really does need to sit down with the press. Somebody told me she's running a risk not having done it prior to the convention because at some point she is going to get tripped up in one of these tough interviews. Better to do that before than after. They've chosen to do it after. I think it's a risky strategy, and she has questions to answer. You look at that economic policy she laid out, and even Jason Furman came out and said, this doesn't add up. And so she's got tough questions to answer on the economy, to Rick's point on immigration, and a whole host of issues. I wish she had done it before, and I do think the counter-programming just underscores the fact we're hearing a lot from Trump and Vance, and not as much in a tough-hitting interview from Kamala Harris. And she's capable of doing it. She's a prosecutor, but she's got to get out there and do it.
Well, it's interesting. I think it's obviously good for the process. It's good for us as journalists to see that happen.
Yeah.
But when I put myself in the shoes of her campaign, why put her out at all, Rick? When you're leading in the polls, while you've got the moment here, doesn't that just add unneeded risk?
Yeah, I think that, to disagree with Jeannie on this, the reality is it's hard to argue that anything she's done since Joe Biden got out of this race has been anything other than perfect. Look at the meteoric rise in her polling number and the enthusiasm in the party. I mean, it's hard to criticize. I like to criticize her economic plan, but the reality is the big problem she's got, or not that she's got it, but the Republicans are making this an issue, right? Oh, you're not talking to the press.
Yes.
The problem is the minute she talks to the press, that goes away as an issue, right? So why invest in that kind of an attack when you know it only takes one interview to offset it? And so I think it's kind of a false flag. It's one of those things that people really don't care about. They see enough of her in reporting. I think we can extend an invitation to come here while she's in Chicago and give an interview to Bloomberg.
Yes.
We'll inoculate that entire attack from.
We can get this done today. Yeah, but I'm not sure that's going to happen, Kim.
We'll let you know where we are, Madam Vice President and her team.
You can find
us here on Bloomberg TV and radio, and you certainly are welcome. Great idea, Rick. Thank you so much. Of course, it would have to be today or Thursday or Friday because she's actually leaving Chicago tomorrow. Jeannie, she and Tim Walz are going to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where the RNC was held just weeks ago. Certainly that location is not a coincidence, but should she really be leaving the big event?
Not if she's supposed to be talking to you, too. But if she's not, no, she absolutely should. She's got to, she's taking it to Donald Trump's house as it will. And she is, going to a swing state, critically important. I do think they want to retain their ability to attract these big crowds has been something that has really upset the former president. So I do think that makes sense. But here's a problem with what Rick said. If she has a flub after this convention in one of these interviews, yes, if she does a great job, that's true. But if she flubs, and she has in the past, then that is going to be a problem for her. So I do think she needs to talk to you guys and the press and get these interviews taken care of because it's becoming an issue.
Does the same go for Tim Walz? Can't he kind of fly cover for her, do some interviews while she's getting her bearings after this convention?
He should. I've learned a lesson the hard way.
Well, I guess that's right.
Sarah Palin undercover for a couple of weeks after the convention and took a lot of heat for it. And I actually do think that affected at least her image a little bit. But he's a readily available guy. He's been on the stump, well in advance of the convention. Nobody had ever heard of Sarah Palin until Wednesday night of our convention. So it's a different circumstance. But look, I mean, it's not like a month from now we're going to have this conversation. It's going to have changed. And so what you look for in politics are those things that will exist past Election Day. And this is not one of those things.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano will last past this segment. They're with us for the week here in Chicago, our signature political panel and Bloomberg Politics contributors. And of course, we still have much more coming up on this program. In the next hour, we'll be joined by two lawmakers. Senator LaFonza Butler will be with us, Congressman Sean Casten as well, also of Illinois. We got a lot of hometown people on the program today.
That's right. That's the idea. They've come from all over the country, 50,000 people in Chicago for this convention. But we are talking with some voices from Chicago with some important local issues tied to the economy that we're going to be addressing here over the balance of this week. It is day one, though, the DNC, just across the street, basically from where we're sitting right now. Kaylee, the roll call is going to follow. The aforementioned party platform will be passed, and then it's on to the speechifying later on.
And of course, that all culminates with the speech from the sitting president, Joe Biden, no longer seeking re-election, in part a legacy speech, in part a passing of the torch to his Vice President, Kamala Harris. It is now her convention, not his, and we'll have it all covered for you, of course, right here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
balance of power.
From Bloomberg Studios in Chicago, just across the street from the United Center at the Democratic National Convention, to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. We will be here all week as this is the nominated convention of Vice President Kamala Harris. But it begins this evening with a primetime address from Joe Biden, the current president, who, of course, made the decision to pass the baton to his VP and will speak tonight, leave town. It is a literal passing of the torch that's about to happen here in Chicago.
Yeah, this is going to be an important night, Kaylee. And of course, there is a bit of business to be had before we get to the speeches tonight with the roll call, the adoption of the party platform. Once that's done, of course, we have official nominees already. As we've discussed, that was handled virtually before we arrived here in Chicago. Then it's going to be rally time. After Joe Biden speaks tonight, the next four all have their own themes, culminating with Kamala Harris on Thursday. Kaylee, this is going to be quite a moment for her, having not known she would be in this position just 5 weeks ago.
That's a very excellent point. And of course, Joe and I will have it fully covered for you, as will our team here in Chicago. Bloomberg's Laura Davison and Gregory Cordy are among them, politics reporter and editor, respectively. Thank you both so much for joining us here in Chicago. It's obviously going to be a week. This will be a marathon, not a sprint. But coming into this, it does feel like Kamala Harris is the candidate of the two, the other being Donald Trump, with the momentum as she arrives here in town, Laura.
Yeah, she has all the money behind her. She's got the celebrities who are excited. The staff who is running the DNC just in the past 3 or 4 weeks has been scrambling to accommodate for all the surge and interest that's happening. They're running a bunch of ads. The polling, new polling over the weekend, both nationwide as well as swing states, shows that she's gaining or in some cases even eclipsing Trump's lead. So Democrats are feeling really, really good right now.
Joe Biden's going to speak to this crowd tonight. The First Lady will as well. Gregory, there's been a lot of reporting about the emotional state that he's in, the way he feels about this some weeks after being urged to drop out of the race. Some of that reporting indicates that he's still pretty angry about it. And as Donald Trump accuses Democrats of staging a coup, how does he thread the needle in this speech?
Yeah, it's been quite a demotion for him, really, because he was supposed to be the headliner speaking on Thursday night, accepting the nomination. Now he's the opening act. And by the reporting we have, he'll give his speech, and then he'll go back to Washington and continue to govern the country, right? Do his day job. He's described his job as sort of the volunteer-in-chief for the Harris campaign. But look, historically, there has been a lot of tension between presidents and the vice presidents who would like to succeed them. And it's only natural that it's even more so under these circumstances. Joe Biden is going to end up being a one-term president, right? He still has his legacy that he wants to cement. That's, I think, a large part of what this speech is going to be about tonight. But also, he needs to pass the baton, and he needs to do so convincingly. He needs to tell Democrats that, no, this was my decision. Kamala Harris is the best candidate to move forward with my agenda.
Well, it raises the question, too, not just the emotional nature of this moment for the president, but for the others who will be gathered in the convention hall tonight, Laura. These are people, some of them sitting lawmakers, who have literally worked with Joe Biden as a politician for decades, who know him, who have been supporters of him during his presidency and beforehand. What is it going to do to the overall vibe of a convention that does feel, as we alluded to, like a celebration coming in, but could maybe not feel as celebratory, but quite bittersweet this evening?
There almost are two camps here. You know, the people who have been involved in Democratic politics for a long time, who were with Joe Biden till the bitter end, who did not want him to see him step down, but of course are now supporting Harris. These are the people who have known him for 50 years. They've worked with him for a long time. You know, Harris is a relative newcomer to Washington. She's really only been there, you know, just for a handful of years. And so she doesn't have some of those deep ties with, you know, longtime party operatives, as well as, you know, donors and other people who are you know, kind of critical to the operation. However, sort of the newcomers, the content creators that they're going to have, the celebrities, all of the stuff that has bubbled up in sort of the more popular culture interest about this, those are the people who are here for Harris, and you know, frankly, in some cases, excited that she is at the top of the ticket and that Biden is now a figure, you know, soon to be a figure of the past.
A lot of folks rose their eyebrows when Democrats announced Chicago as the site of this convention, and everyone started talking about 1968. That conversation has not ended, as tens of thousands of protesters have also joined us here. The parallels go beyond just the geography, Gregory. This is a party that's just seen a sitting president decide publicly to step down. We've got thousands of protesters around us. Gunfire has been heard on the campaign trail in the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. And the cultural and generational divides are pronounced. You can't move away from the comparisons in this case. How does Kamala Harris turn our attention away from what happened in 1968?
Look, I may well be the oldest person at this table, but I was born after 1968, so I don't remember. I think a lot of Americans don't remember that. It certainly does have some historic resonance, and we'll have to see. Look, if we get anything approaching what we saw in 1968, obviously it's going to be a game-changing event for this campaign. Sure. But in the meantime, we have had a routine since the 1990s of really treating these conventions as, they're called national security special events. Mm-hmm. Secret Service is the lead agency, but we have police officers here from several states around, not just Chicago, but they're coming from Ohio and Wisconsin and Minnesota, police on the ground. You can't walk down Michigan Avenue without seeing literally thousands of police officers. True. And so this is, they're going to try to run a tight ship, but you also have protesters from all over those states and beyond that I just talked about. And the people, this is especially for the Democratic Party, you have constituency groups that want to make their voice heard. And the loudest one right now is the progressives within the party who are very angry about what's going on in Gaza right now. And they're going to make their voice heard.
Well, and of course, it comes against a backdrop of ongoing efforts toward a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas. The U.S., Qatar, Egypt are involved in these conversations. It's just frankly still unclear at this point, Laura, whether they will have a different end result than the negotiations we've seen over the last several months and actually result in a ceasefire. This is something we have heard Kamala Harris advocating for on the campaign trail. Do you expect she'll take her moment on Thursday night to do the same, to try to influence the outcome of policy here?
She can't not address this. This has to, this is the big elephant in the room. This is the major issue dividing the party, and she's going to have to sort of nod at this in some level. She is, however, in a very politically advantageous position because Biden, as president, is still working on this, and this is one of the issues he sees as his legacy-defining things, one of the things he wants to wrap up before he's out of office. So he can kind of do the hard work of that while she can talk about it, she can frame it, she can message it to the party, but they're able to, this is one of the key advantages of her being able to focus on the campaign trail, and he can focus on the foreign policy side.
Reporting from Bloomberg's best, Laura Davison and Gregory Cordy. Great to see you both at the table here as we kick things off for this week in Chicago. Joining us from just outside the United Center is California Senator LaFonza Butler. Senator, we want to welcome you to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's great to be with you today in Chicago. I think it's safe to say that you know Kamala Harris better than most Americans ever will. And as we consider what she's going through right now, being shot out of a cannon here at a Democratic National Convention that she could not have planned for even 2 months ago, tell us what she's going through emotionally.
Look, thank you so much for having me, for covering this, for offering this experience to folks who are watching and listening on Bloomberg. I couldn't pretend to know what Vice President Harris is feeling. None of us could. She was so committed to being a loyal governing partner to President Biden. And today begins the convention that is the process of nominating her as the Democratic presidential nominee for this country. And so it is an exciting experience I could imagine. I have spoken to her. She feels and sounds incredibly determined to be a leader that offers a vision forward for our country and for the American people, a way to unify us behind not just our fears and the things that we are concerned about, but also about our hopes and our dreams and the things that we can accomplish together. And so it must be incredibly exciting for her family, but I know this is a moment that she is determined to meet, and one that she, I think, will meet with great grace.
Connection lost.
Well, Senator, of course, none of us can actually get inside the Democratic nominee's head at this time, but could you take us inside yours, knowing that before you were a senator, you ran Emily's List. It is a group literally dedicated to get women elected into office. Now we have not just a woman, but a woman of color getting ready to formally accept the Democratic nomination for president. What does this week mean to you?
I'm not sure that I know exactly what it will mean. I am so focused on making sure that I do everything I can to make this moment not just a moment that happens as a nominating experience, but an experience that actually leads to victory for the country in November. But you're right. I have worked to help to elect Democratic pro-choice women up and down the ballot at all levels of government, and to again be able to say that the United States, at least one party, is putting forth a woman and a woman of color for the American people to consider for a presidency is quite powerful, not just for my daughter, but truly for America's daughters to be able to see themselves once and for all in the highest position possible in our country. It is a moment of pride for me, and I think it will be a moment of great pride for the American people.
Senator, what is Joe Biden going to tell the room tonight as he passes the baton, the cliche that we keep using for this inflection point in the campaign? There's been reporting that he's very upset about what has happened, but of course it's his job to strike a positive tone. What should be his message? What are we going to hear from Joe Biden?
Look, this is, I expect that we're going to hear the words of a proud statesman who has served his country for the last 52 years, made sacrifice after sacrifice to help us win back the soul of our very nation. He said that was why he was running in 2020. This is a president who will have accomplished by the end of his term some of the most historic legislation ever, changing the trajectory of so many industry and opportunities for the American people, whether we're talking about the cancellation of student loan debt to the inaction of the CHIPS and Science Act, the biggest investments in climate change in our nation's history, doing the work of the PACT Act and taking care of our veterans and their health care. So look, this is a moment, I think, where President Biden will have the opportunity to not only talk about what he's accomplished, but to thank the American people for trusting him to lead in such a hard, tough moment. And I think he's going to commit to continue to finish the job, that we have a lot more work to do. He has another 5 months left in his term. He's going to be focused on continuing to run through the tape. But he's going to be exciting us and imploring us to continue to fight for the democracy that future generations in this country truly deserve.
Well, and of course, that fight will become Kamala Harris's throughout the remainder of this campaign. And then, of course, if she ultimately wins when she takes office in January of 2025, we are starting, Senator, to get at least the outlines of the kind of policy that she would like to pursue when it comes to the economy. And I ask you this knowing that you sit on the Senate Banking Committee. Some of the policies she put forward last week have been described as potentially inflationary. Donald Trump has suggested they borderline on communism, calling her now comrade. Kamala, are the ideas that she put forward really realistic?
Look, I think the former president has tried his attempt at name-calling against everyone who dared to take him on, and this is a presidential candidate, vice president in Kamala Harris, that is doing just that, taking him on and putting forward visions and plans that actually bring our country together, that address some of our highest cost-driving issues that working families face today, the cost of housing, whether they want to own or rent, the cost of prescription drugs, whether they're taking cancer medication, or an elderly who's just trying to manage their diabetes, or just trying to make it every single day in the grocery store, buying bread and eggs and chicken to make sure that their family has food to eat. Yes, she has put forth an ambitious, I believe, practical approach that is about how do we listen to what the American people need from government and actually make plans to act. Are the plans going to turn out exactly the way that that she put forth in her proposal in North Carolina? This is all going to be a process. She said herself what she wants to do is bring stakeholders together. She wants to bring industry and legislators and unions together to figure out how we try to solve some of these problems. I don't know what former President Trump is to do any of that. He hasn't said. He just says that he wants to create what in essence is a tax for the American people to raise their costs. So I'd rather be a part of a process to find a solid solution for the American people than some pipe dream tax that's going to raise the cost for every American person. And I think every day about my mother on a fixed income, 71 years old. I know she can't afford Donald Trump's tax.
Senator Butler, we have breaking news on the terminal with regard to Israel, and this is going to be important for the delegates on the floor of this convention. Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, says Benjamin Netanyahu has accepted a ceasefire proposal that they've been working on for days now. This just crossed the terminal. Netanyahu accepting latest Gaza proposal. He's speaking with reporters right now, talking about this U.S.-backed bridging proposal for a ceasefire, calling on Hamas to do the same. Your party platform, Senator, also calls for, quote, immediate and lasting ceasefire deal, unquote. If this comes to fruition, if we do have a ceasefire deal, are those 30 uncommitted delegates on the floor going to become committed to Kamala Harris?
You know, I don't know. I surely hope so. I wouldn't venture to speak for them, but let me just first say, thank God. The tragedy that we have been seeing that began on October 7th and has continued in the lives of innocent Palestinian families. I am glad that Joe Biden has remained on the case and has not let a night go by where he wasn't working towards accomplishing this ceasefire. If that is the case, this is a great and important day for the presidency of President Biden and a great moment of, I think, relief for so many families, Israeli and Palestinian families alike.
Well, and certainly it could be a moment of relief if you are actively campaigning for president, knowing that this is an issue, Senator, that has divided your party. And we've seen that on display with the delegates that Joe is alluding to, with the protests that will be here in Chicago. If a ceasefire can be accomplished, what's the biggest hurdle for your party to get over when it comes to voter turnout or to ensuring a victory for Kamala Harris?
Yeah, look, this is a war and a conflict that is beyond party politics. Both sides have taken their own positions. What we have seen President Biden and Vice President Harris work towards is that lasting ceasefire, the return of those hostages. And hopefully as the details of this deal becomes more clear, that we will have accomplished those things. And let's focus on these are lives that have been lost here. Tens of thousands of lives, the rape and torture of Israeli families on October 7th. I'm not going to jump into a conversation about politics when we're talking about people's lives. Yes, there has been disagreement in our country about this, but let's celebrate what is happening here. There are hundreds of Americans and Israelis and others that are actually going to be able to come home after nearly a year. Let's celebrate what we're accomplishing and recognize the diplomacy and the committed leadership that President Biden and Vice President Harris have brought, and all of the global leaders who have leaned in here to help make this happen.
Fair enough, Senator. Thank you so much for joining us outside the United Center here in Chicago. That is California's Democratic Senator LaFonza Butler. We appreciate your time, ma'am. And of course, to reiterate the breaking news here, Joe, Secretary of State Antony Blinken says that Israel and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has accepted this U.S.-backed bridging proposal for a ceasefire. He is now calling on Hamas to do the same. Of course, this is not a done deal until Hamas does so. There are two parties that need to agree to this.
Well, and remembering that Joe Biden rolled out a 6-point plan on the 31st of May that he said Benjamin Netanyahu had signed off on. So we have seen this movie before. We'll find out if it ends differently. Coming up, Congressman Sean Casten with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines live at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Monday, it's day one with work to be had. In the next few hours, we'll see Democrats adopt a party platform and codify the nominations, already done virtually, but here in Chicago, of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. Kaylee, it'll all come together later this evening with an address by President Biden, as we hear so much about passing the baton. This is actually it today.
Yeah, it will be a physical manifestation of that. He, of course, will be speaking after his wife, First Lady Jill Biden, in what is surely going to be emotional, as it was just over 4 weeks ago that the president made the decision to not seek re-election and instead to endorse Kamala Harris, who is getting ready to formally accept the nomination this week. It's a question of looking back at the past 3.5 years while looking forward to the next 4 that Kamala Harris would like to promise to the American people should she win in November.
That'll be the trajectory of the week here. Former President Barack Obama tomorrow night, Tim Walz Wednesday, and of course Kamala Harris in her acceptance speech on Thursday. We're going to be talking a lot about issues, many of which are mentioned in the party platform. We're also going to be talking about the massive protests that are expected. We saw some smaller protest marches last night, Kaylee, but there are tens of thousands of people who have made their way to Chicago because of one issue. That's Israel, and it's one that we're actually hearing some headlines on today.
Yeah, the breaking news just crossing the Bloomberg terminal from Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who says Israel and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have accepted a U.S.-backed bridge ceasefire proposal. They're calling on Hamas to do the same. Of course, it is not official until Hamas does so, but this could be an incredibly important moment for the incumbent president and for the presidential candidate herself, Kamala Harris, as this is an issue that has been quite politically disruptive, I would say, within the Democratic Party. And joining us now is someone who is within the Democratic Party and also is in his home state of Illinois. Congressman Sean Casten is here with us in our studios in Chicago. Congressman, it's great to see you, sir.
Thank you.
Obviously, this is just breaking as we speak, but I do wonder what your reaction is to this news that maybe a ceasefire is one step closer as we await word from Hamas.
You know, I think we're hopeful. I represent one of the largest Palestinian diasporas in the country, and you know we've had personal constituent stories where we've had to help get people out of Gaza, get people out of the West Bank, try to get people with their land freed up. I've also spent quite a bit of time traveling in the region and meeting with hostage families, and that there is a deal to be had. There's a deal that's been havable for a long time with absolutely getting the hostages back, absolutely preserving our relationship with Israel, absolutely providing dignity and hope, and hopefully ultimately a path to a Palestinian state. You know, unfortunately, some of the right-wing elements of the Israeli government and Hamas have been the biggest obstacles to that deal. So I'm encouraged to hear that maybe we have something. But we'll have to see what Hamas does next.
If this news is made official, if Hamas does accept this deal in the middle of the Democratic National Convention, what does that do to the issue? What does that do to the uncommitted delegates or the protesters outside the room? You're the perfect person to answer that, as you are specifically representing many constituents who are upset about this.
Well, given how long this conflict has persisted, I think if we try to solve it to address short-term U.S. political issues, we're probably not thinking about it the right way. You know, if this has been a long time coming. It was not helped in the prior administration when you know we had the Abraham Accords, which created some peace, but stapled to the Abraham Accords was this idea that it was okay for the Netanyahu government to sort of slice and dice the West Bank into this, you know, into something that gave no continuous property. And politically, of course, it would be wonderful to have a solution right now, but I think it's much more important that we have a long-term solution that we can look back on 5-10 years from now and say, this was a turning point, not just this was something that was politically well-timed.
Sure, and of course there is a massive humanitarian aspect here that we have to consider. Obviously, this is an issue you're passionate about given your constituency, Congressman, but we know there's other issues that you're passionate about and focus on in your work in Congress as well, one of them being climate. Taking a look at the policy platform the party's getting set to adopt today. Chapter 4 is tackling the climate crisis and along with that lowering energy costs. Obviously, Joe Biden has tried to be a climate president, certainly in the Inflation Reduction Act. He has had some legislative accomplishments in that regard. What do you expect Kamala Harris can do to advance that agenda moving forward, realistically knowing she might not necessarily have both chambers of Congress to work with here?
Well, number one, we have to give tremendous credit to Joe Biden. This was the single biggest climate bill ever passed by any government in the history of the world. And that came from my friend and my colleague, Kathy Castor, on the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. We came up with a list of about 700 proposals, of which 300 of them are now law through the Inflation Reduction Act. Those are not only good bills for climate, they're good bills for energy. If you can heat your house without buying natural gas, you don't have to pay for natural gas. If you can drive your car without buying gasoline, you don't have to pay for gasoline. If you can power your house without buying electricity, you don't have to pay for electricity. Clean energy is cheap energy. And what's happened as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act has been a huge investment in America, huge amounts of capital that have come to build battery factories, electric vehicle charging. The challenges now, which are really good challenges, is we're creating jobs faster than skilled workers. We need to build the ecosystem to do that. We're building power plants where we have really cheap resources like sun, like wind. That's not necessarily where the wires are. And so how do we make it easier to build the transmission system, to build that up to load? We've got huge industries and factories and homes that are electrifying. They also need more power. So this is a huge investment opportunity. And I think the challenge that the Harris team understands is this is really a shift in our energy policy, from an energy policy that focuses on the interests of energy producers to an energy policy that focuses on the interest of energy consumers. And just to highlight that point, April 2020, Donald Trump got on the phone, called the Saudis and said, I'm taking the troops out of Saudi Arabia unless you cut production to increase oil prices because our oil producers are struggling with cheap oil prices. Understand who the Republican agenda is fighting for. They're fighting to raise energy prices for energy producers, and the Harris agenda is to fight to lower prices for consumers.
Well, interesting, because we're pumping a record amount of gas and oil right now. Donald Trump says drill, baby, drill is his answer to the inflation that we're experiencing here. Increased production, lower energy costs, everything else follows. He's also promising to roll back, essentially to do away with the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, if he's elected. Do you take him at his word?
Donald Trump also says that electric vehicles could cause you to get attacked by a shark. I don't really know that his energy policy has a lot of.
I think Elon Musk turned him around on that last time. I'm not sure. But I mean, could Congress protect the IRA if Donald Trump's in the White House?
What we did very intentionally in the IRA is the IRA is long on carrots and short on sticks. There are a lot of communities in rural America, urban America, red America, blue America that are benefiting from access to capital. Once you have a solar panel on your roof, there is no scenario where you say the price of electricity is too low today for me to justify operating my solar panel, right? On the other hand, if you've got a gas turbine, there are times when you say, boy, the price of gas is too high for me to justify operating the gas turbine. So that capital deployment is going to be very hard to undo. I do think it's important on this sort of drill, baby, drill is like run the math. U.S. coal consumption has collapsed in the last decade. U.S. oil consumption is flat over the last decade. Gas consumption is up, but it's decoupled from GDP growth. Our economy is decarbonizing. The only future for the oil, gas, and coal industry, production industry in the U.S. is for exports. And so we're seeing this surge in exports in the United States and indeed a surge in production. But I think the question we have is like, if we as Americans know that we have access to cheaper and cleaner energy, are we going to make a commitment to exporting the technologies that we've manufactured in the United States with U.S. expertise so that other countries can benefit from our knowledge? Or are we going to export the more expensive, dirty energy sources that we've decided can't compete in our economy? Like, that's the practical reality. And again, there is a difference there between the two candidates. But you're right that the U.S. is producing record amounts of oil and gas right now, but it's increasingly for export.
Well, but Donald Trump does see it as a way in which to fight inflation. So it becomes, if it's not drill, baby, drill for the Democratic Party or for Vice President Harris, the actual efforts that she would have to fight inflation. Some of the economic policies she rolled out last week, and I'm asking you as a member of the Financial Services Committee, you get to question Chairman Powell and Treasury Secretary Yellen frequently. We think about some policies as being inflationary, including, for example, subsidizing home ownership or anything that could create a larger deficit that you can't necessarily pay for. All of this could have inflationary effects, could it not? How do you really look at the platform she rolled out last week?
Well, look at what happened since 2020. The United States, there was a global surge in inflation. The United States, because of the actions that we took in the American Rescue Plan, saw inflation rise slower than other OECD countries and come down faster, right? And the big difference, and this was very intentional, was, particularly compared to 2008, was to try to make sure that we were getting resources to people regardless of whether or not they had existing banking relationships, right? And so, yes, we saw inflation in the United States, but we saw wage inflation generally higher than goods inflation in the U.S. Didn't happen in other countries, right? So we've seen a closing of the wealth gap, particularly with lower quartiles, black and brown communities who have historically been left behind. And that structure of saying, let's make it easier for folks to buy homes, let's make it easier for people to buy things like solar panels that maybe they don't have the capital for it, but once they have it, now they have cheaper energy, right? And to push from there, and just to come back on the export again, we have massive amounts of oil and gas in the United States. If we want to keep oil and gas costs low in the United States, we should maximize the supply in the United States, because high supply leads to low prices, right? When we export, we actually raise the price. And you've seen there's the Freeport LNG terminal down in Texas had an outage a couple of years ago. When it went out, immediately the price of gas, natural gas in the United States, went down, because all of a sudden we couldn't export as much, and there was a surge in the United States. Again, what is in our interest? Is it in our interest to lower costs for American consumers, or in our interest to raise prices so that U.S. exporters can make more money? That's an inflation strategy, right? The other thing that I just say on inflation is one of the real blessings that's helped keep inflation low has been because the United States is a country that people want to come to. We've seen a surge in net immigration to the United States, which has kept wage pressure down. And of course, we want secure borders, but I think it's important to understand that an intelligent immigration policy is one of the tools that we have to keep inflation down. And if we just look at what Donald Trump's saying, I'm going to clamp down on inflation, I'm going to increase tariffs, that's a massively inflationary policy.
We have less than a minute left, Congressman. Will it be incumbent upon Kamala Harris then to explain to the American people, with your financial services hat on, why her plans are not inflationary?
I trust the American people to understand that. I trust the American people to understand. I mean, one of the things that I like to do, I did a town hall a while ago, and somebody said, what are you doing to lower inflation? And I said, did you get a raise last year? And the guy said, I did. I said, was it a good raise? He said, yeah, it was pretty good. And I said, well, number one, you're welcome. Number two, does it bother you that that was inflationary?
It's funny how that works.
What matters is that people have more money in their pocket after they've bought all of the groceries and everything else. Exactly. And I think we've seen a really strong and growing record growth in the U.S. economy, record low unemployment. We're going to keep it up.
It's great to have you here.
Thank
in
you.
Chicago. Have a great convention.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
On Bloomberg TV and radio. Illinois Congressman Sean Casten with us here on Balance of Power. We've got a lot more ahead from Chicago, but we want to keep tabs on the markets too. And for that, we turn to Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle in New York. How's it going, Abigail?
Well, Joe, you know, it's interesting. We're looking at a classic summer melt up here. We now have the S&P 500 up for an 8th day in a row. That's the longest winning streak going back to November of 2023. The NASDAQ 100 is also higher, heading to a 5th up day. And the Russell 2000, or those small cap stocks, those more domestically based stocks during this DNC week, outperforming a little bit, up 0.8%, up for a 3rd day in a row. Now, beneath the surface, though, volume is pretty anemic for that S&P 500, 30% below the recent average. So investors not all that committed to these gains, which is sort of interesting. And of course, we did have that big sell-off into the last 8 days, down about 10%, now up about 7%. So still at a deficit from the recent highs. Now, influencing trade today, some retail earnings will trickle in this week. They actually did already, Estee Lauder, and then importantly Target. But I would say this week is much more about the macro, because of course we do have the DNC and election 2024, that focus. We also have the yen. There's been so much news about the yen carry trade unwind, and in fact, a couple of weeks ago when stocks were selling off so brutally, that had everything to do with the Haven yen rallying, which pushes the dollar yen lower. When the yen is lower, the actual yen, it provides cheap money for people to borrow borrow that and then put it into any other risk asset. One of the reasons that we may have had such a big rally, robust rally for stocks so far this year. Now, earlier today, that yen had rallied by more than 1%. At that point, stocks about flat. But now that it's off of those highs, I think that's giving a little bit of relief to stocks. Plus, we have bonds rallying. That means yields are lower in expectation with the Fed. And speaking of the Fed, Jackson Hole later this week will be listening to Fed Chair Jerome Powell's keynote speech, one of the highlights for market watchers every year. I think it's largely expected that he's going to toe the line in terms of cuts ahead. But of course, we are at DNC election 2024. If we go into the Bloomberg terminal and take a look at where predicted is relative to the betting odds, well, it is wider, but it's also narrower. So at the widest between Kamala Harris, VP Harris, and Donald Trump, it was something like 12 to 13%. Now it's 10% in favor of Kamala Harris, with Donald Trump trailing, which is, of course, a big reversal of what had been the case with Joe Biden. And on the day, we do have the shares of some of the Harris trade stocks, such as grocers, trading lower on the prospect of stabilized grocery prices, home builders higher, and DJT itself is down. So overall, Kaylee, I would say it's not a bad day for the quote-unquote Harris trade, this as the DNC, of course, kicks off.
All right, Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle in New York, thank you so much. Keeping an eye on the political and market implications of politics, we always appreciate, but of course giving us a good reminder that this convention is not happening in a vacuum. It comes at the same week as Jackson Hole, where we'll hear from Chairman Powell at the end of the week about interest rates and the trajectory of them, which could have implications for this election. It also comes with ceasefire talks making progress in the Middle East. The headline crossing this hour from the Bloomberg terminal, Secretary of State Antony Blinken saying that Israel has accepted a ceasefire agreement, and now we wait for Hamas.
In a very constructive meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu today, he confirmed to me that Israel accepts the bridging proposal, that he supports it. It's now incumbent on Hamas to do the same. And then the parties, with the help of the mediators, the United States, Egypt, and Qatar, have to come together and complete the process of reaching clear understandings about how they'll implement the commitments that they've made.
So let's bring back now our political panel here in Chicago. Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. So incredible to get this news as we're sitting here in Chicago waiting for President Biden to speak this evening, knowing that he has said a ceasefire agreement is one of the things he wants to make sure he accomplishes before leaving office. Obviously, there are massive humanitarian implications here for the people living in Gaza, for the families of the hostages, for the hostages themselves, Jeannie, that cannot go unsaid. But politically, this is significant as well.
This is, and I think, you know, we can be cautiously optimistic about what Antony Blinken has said, but of course I think we have to be cautious because at the same time Hamas has said it's dissatisfied with what it describes as some of Israel's demands in this. And so I think we do, to your point, have to wait and see. If this comes to fruition, the timing is critically important for all of the reasons you mentioned, which are the most important, but also politically, because if it came together today before President Biden speaks, that would be enormously important for his legacy, which he is attached to this in a profound way. And of course, issues involving the Middle East have had an enormously negative impact on presidents going back several decades in the U.S. So for him to be thinking about leaving office in January and to have a win like this, if it happens, would be enormously important.
Well, caution is the important word, I think, in your setup there, Jeannie, because we've seen this before. Joe Biden made an address to the nation from the White House about this plan back around Memorial Day, and it was not signed off on at the time, apparently, by the Netanyahu government, and Hamas went back and forth for weeks on this. It ended with nothing. We just asked Sean Casten, who made clear that his constituents represent one of the largest blocs of pro-Palestinian voters in the country. He was very careful when we asked him about this. He didn't want to see this move in too quickly this week, a long-term deal, he said. How careful should Democrats be right now with such a hot issue around this convention?
Yeah, I think you have to be very careful. I'm pessimistic that if your peace is reliant upon Hamas, you're going to have to wait. Hamas wants a permanent ceasefire. They don't want a situational one. And for that reason alone, they will probably reject this offer. They've rejected previous offers that were similar in nature to this one. As you say, they've been talking about this for a long time. I don't think there's any reason to believe that Hamas is going to see this as anything different.
Is it smart politically to do this in public then, to goad them to it?
Well, look, I mean, I think it's good to have government transparency, right? I mean, like, this is an important issue, as Jeannie says. To a lot of people, it's not just politics. And I think it's good that this is being aired out. We don't normally get to see sausage being made in these kinds of negotiations. But I think it's too soon to tell whether or not Hamas is prepared to come to the table and actually be a part of a community that wants to see peace. It's not been their history, and they've been very clear that they want a permanent ceasefire. They just don't want to pay for it.
Well, it's also worth noting Hamas operates as a proxy of Iran. We are still awaiting Iranian retaliation against Israel for the assassination of leaders of Hezbollah and of course, Hamas in Tehran earlier this summer. So that maybe is a complicating factor in all of this as well. But it was described to us as, by our political editor, Laura Davison, earlier this hour, Jeannie, as really something that actually can create some separation between President Biden, who is president and therefore is the one that really has to deal with this, and Kamala Harris, who can speak about it, who can try to frame it to her benefit, but doesn't necessarily have that commander-in-chief title at this time, where this is incumbent upon her to deal with. So to what extent, regardless of whether or not Hamas accepts or the negotiations are still ongoing, should Harris be talking about this issue or others, like economy and the border, at the convention this week?
You know, I think the convention, we're not going to hear a lot of policy specifics. I think we're going to hear an introduction of Kamala Harris because a lot of people are not intimately familiar with her, even though she's been in our lives as vice president for almost 4 years now. So that's going to be what she does this week. We will hear more about policy going forward. But to your point, I don't think we're going to hear a lot on the specifics of something like this. And so, you know, she is going to try to get some of that separation from President Biden on things that he is not particularly popular on, and try to embrace those things he is. So if there was a win on this, that would be enormously helpful. But most importantly, for the families of the hostages and you know, all the people affected by this, regardless of the politics of this thing.
Well, you know, if you're running a convention, though, and you've got 30 uncommitted delegates on the floor, is this an opportunity? There may not be a deal here, but this week in Chicago, there might be a sit-down conversation between the Harris campaign and those delegates to say, look, we're trying to move the ball.
Right. I think anything you can do to sort of inoculate the convention to delegates who aren't looking at the same success you are is important. You're going to do that anyway.
You wouldn't just ignore it.
They've been doing it. You wouldn't just ignore it. Maybe their bus breaks down on the way to the convention on Thursday night, but that's another thing. But the reality is you don't usually get hard news at a convention. And it would be really a kudo for Biden to be able to talk about this tonight. Now, with Israel signing on, maybe that's enough for him. But to get a ceasefire the night of your, you know, last speech to the convention as president, it would be a really special moment for him. And suffice it to say, I doubt if Hamas is really caring whether or not Joe Biden has a good night or not.
Well, fair enough, but it will be a night for Joe Biden, the only one, frankly, he's going to get at this convention. Jeannie, we've talked at length about how difficult this moment may be emotionally, given his long career in public service, but he has made the decision to pass the baton and will do so in a very real way. This evening, we're also going to be hearing from members of his family. Jill Biden is speaking tonight. Ashley Biden is introducing him, according to the speaker's list. What tone do you expect to hear, not just from the president, but from those closest to him?
I think we're going to hear the closeness of their relationship with their husband, their father. You know, this is a family who has gone through so much trauma, especially in the last few years. And so I think we're going to hear a lot of love and respect from them. And I think they're going to be celebrating his work. I mean, 1972, he enters Congress at 29, and he departs today, the convention, or tonight, the convention, and in a few months, the presidency. So it's a big, big moment for him. But I think most important, they're all going to agree, we want Kamala Harris to succeed and beat Donald Trump.
So prepare for a lot of young photos of Joe Biden with dark hair is what you're saying.
That's right.
Great conversation with our signature panel, as always. Rick Davis, Jeannie Shanzano. are going to be with us for the week here in Chicago, with a lot more to follow as the DNC gets underway. We are expecting to get more details about Vice President Harris's policy platform. In fact, we heard a preview last week when it came to the economy specifically, and housing even more so. For more on that issue, we bring in Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, who's just outside the Convention Hall, the United Center here in Chicago. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Joe. Housing affordability and availability are becoming top issues on the campaign trail. As you mentioned, Vice President Kamala Harris started to unveil some of her economic policies last week. While we're still waiting for more details, she did make housing a key part of her policy proposal. I want you to take a listen here to what she told voters on Friday when it came to housing and how she's messaging around the issue.
I know how to fight for people who are being exploited in the housing market. And I know what home ownership means. It's more than a financial transaction. It's so much more than that. It's more than a house.
Harris's plan calls for the construction of 3 million new housing units over 4 years, as well as a tax incentive for building starter homes. Harris has also pledged $25,000 in down payment assistance for some first-time homebuyers, and the campaign is also urging Congress to pass an act that would curtail major investors from buying single-family homes in bulk for development. Now, Fed Chair Jerome Powell has said that tighter monetary policy is impacting the housing market, and we'll have to wait to see how any expected rate cuts in September could unlock the market in any way. But Joe and Kaylee, Powell also often points out that the Fed can control a shortage of affordable housing units in the parts of the market that need it the most.
Yep, can hit demand but not supply. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall reporting outside the United Center. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm pleased to bring in now with us here in Chicago someone with a unique perspective on real estate and rates in general. The CEO of Chicago developer Sterling Bay, Andy Glore, is here on set with Joe and I. Welcome to Bloomberg TV and Radio. Andy, it's great to have you. I would like to start, as we are here for the Democratic Convention. It is DNC week. It's also Jackson Hole week, which our audience is perhaps just as equally, if not more, enthused about. Obviously, the real estate industry has felt high interest rates in a very real way. What kind of cuts are you expecting, and what happens for your business, for your industry when they come?
Well, I will say this. I mean, I think the commercial real estate business has been under a Category 5 storm for a few years now, to say the least. And if you look at the real estate business, you can only control so many things: your cost of capital, your cost to build the building, and then how much people will pay. And unfortunately, two of those things have been at all-time highs for the last 25 years. And so we are hoping, I was hoping in June something might have happened, but we're hoping for at least 50 basis points in September and hopefully another 50 basis points. And I think that will be a green shoot that everyone's looking for, that will slowly start allowing the capital that's been sitting on the sidelines to start investing.
You got to love coming on Bloomberg. Kaylee Lyons hit you with the Fed on the first time.
We got a lot more to say there,
Well, I bet that's true. Talk to us about Chicago, though. What would that mean for record vacancy rates in this city that have been so sticky?
Yeah, I think if you look at Chicago, it's not dissimilar to other major urban areas. Is that you have concentration of office, you have office that is B and C type product, and so I think you need to lower the cost of capital for people to start making investments back into these urban areas. And let's face it, if we need to get these cities back on track, we need to get people coming back to work, and I think that you need to change some of the fundamentals, as I said, with interest rates, to make that a reality.
Is the money there, though? Is the interest there? Everyone's waiting for the bottom, waiting for the moment?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say we're in the trough. Yeah. And I think people are just looking for a green shoot. They want to see the Fed make a move. And I think most people think the Fed was too slow in curbing inflation up front. I think that's widely accepted. I just hope they're not too slow on lowering rates going forward.
Okay, so if we're in the trough, does that make this the prime opportunity for a bargain?
Yes.
Then are you running out of time to pick up on some of those opportunities?
Real estate doesn't move that quickly, but what I would say over the next 2 quarters, I don't think there is a better time in commercial real estate to acquire because of the dislocation. So I think you're right. I think the opportunities that we're seeing, we haven't seen in 20 years. And so I think it is a great time. And now it's a contrarian move. You have to have the capital there, but I do think there's a lot of institutional capital sitting on the sidelines waiting for the Fed to make a move.
We've heard a bit from Donald Trump about the city of Chicago. Just most recently, about a week ago, compared it to Afghanistan referring to crime stats here. Let's go back to 2019, as this is not a new refrain for the former president. Here's Donald Trump.
It's embarrassing to us as a nation. All over the world, they're talking about Chicago. Afghanistan is a safe place by comparison. It's true.
Saying the same thing now 5 years later. What does Donald Trump not understand about Chicago?
I think at the time, during the pandemic, Chicago, like other urban areas, it was a terrible time, and crime skyrocketed. I think if you look at the statistics now, we're going in the right direction.
Not just pointing to the 4th of July just last week, said 117 shootings took place here, more than happened in Afghanistan.
I'll say this, it's a #1 priority for the city. It needs to remain a #1 priority. No one is happy with where we're at right now. It needs to improve, but we are taking steps in the right direction, whether that takes another year or two or longer. I just want to make sure that no matter what happens over the next few years, it has to remain a top priority. If people don't feel safe here, they're not going to relocate their businesses here. They're not going to live here. So that has to remain a top priority.
Well, and of course, the city's not a monolith. You've invested in specific areas. You were a key part in building out Fulton Market. Where are you looking at new opportunities? As we talk about picking up these bargains and spending capital, where within Chicago do you invest?
I mean, I think if you look at the demographics, we obviously have substantial holdings here in Chicago, but we're in a dozen markets around the country. We're in Charlotte, we're in Atlanta, we're in Durham, we're in Miami, we're in Austin. So we are definitely diversified geographically. We're also diversified from a product standpoint. So we started off doing primarily office, and now we do office, industrial, life science, and residential. So
with our eyes on the housing market for a moment, we're just hearing about Kamala Harris's platform. She's offering, or wants to offer, $25,000 in down payment assistance to more than 1 million first-time home buyers. What would that do to the market? What would that do to prices?
Well, I would say this. There's a national housing shortage, both for workforce housing and just housing in general. And so we have to find a way to jumpstart that segment. And one of those ways is lowering rates. And one of those ways potentially could be government incentives to expedite that process. But it's definitely an issue, not just in Chicago, but around the country as well.
Well, you clearly have some thoughts for Chairman Powell, and others have as well. I mean, Donald Trump has suggested that he would like to play a role in monetary policy decision-making if he wins. Kamala Harris, for her part, seems to be more on the Fed is independent train. But it does speak to this idea that the outcome of this election could have an impact here as well. So knowing the lens with which you are viewing it, what is your view on what happens in November?
I would say as long as there's open communication and collaboration, it's not unlike what's happening with the Supreme Court. But whether that should be a term for life, I'm not the guy to answer that. But I do think there needs to be some input from the government into the Fed.
You do?
Yeah, I do. I do. What that looks like, what autonomy they maintain. As I said, it's not my expertise, but I do think, based on how I think too slow they were to cut rates, and hopefully they're going to, lower rates. I'm sorry, too slow to raise rates, and hopefully they're too aggressive to cut rates would be better. So I don't have the answer to that. They need to maintain their autonomy. At the same token, I think a little more communication, a little more collaboration would be better.
Donald Trump told Bloomberg Business Week that he'd like to keep Jay Powell on, which surprised a lot of people. It didn't seem like a real big fan. You think that's a good idea if he's reelected?
That's out of my lane.
I finally found the
That's
sweet
way
spot.
out of my lane. Okay, I don't know. Not to say we don't think rates should have gone down earlier. But that's I don't know.
You'll take the Fed share you get, it sounds like.
Exactly.
Many thanks to Sterling Bay CEO Andy Glure. What a fascinating look at the city that we're all getting to know all over again here. Kaylee, thanks for being with us.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate your time, sir. And of course, Andy, here with us. We are just guests in the city this week, along with tens of thousands of other people who are here in town for the Democratic National Convention.
50,000 for the convention. I think you can add quite a bit more when you consider the protesters who are in town here, Kaylee. We're going to see how this goes. We'll spend some time between now and the late edition of Balance of Power, check things out on the streets of Chicago, and let you know a little bit later on as we work our way up to Joe Biden's speech tonight. It does it from the Democratic National Convention for now. As I mentioned, we'll be back 5 p.m. Eastern. For Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. Thanks for being with us on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everyone. Live on Bloomberg TV Radio, streaming on YouTube and Bloomberg Originals. I'm Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Business Week. Carol Masser is off today, but with us in her stead is Bloomberg News cross-asset reporter Emily Griffeo in for Carol. Emily, how are you?
I'm doing well.
Good.
Happy to be here.
Good. Well, we got a great show coming up. Stocks higher for an 8th straight day. It's the longest winning streak so far this year. Traders are hoping that the Fed is going to signal it's ready to start cutting rates. We're going to have more on that in just a few minutes, and also how greed has overcome fear on Wall Street. As I mentioned, still ahead, we're looking forward to hearing from Joe Matthew. He's on the ground in Chicago at the DNC, where President Biden is going to headline tonight. We're going to check in with him in just a few minutes.
And it's Merger Monday. The owner of Circle K is going after the owner of 7-Eleven. This after the busiest July for M&A in 3 years. What does it say about the deals landscape? Also, what NFL players really think about sports gambling.
And our one more thing this afternoon, expectations of losing one's job are at a record high, at least according to one survey. We're going to explain in just a little bit. All that and more over the next hour. First up, though, a check on the day's trade and top business stories. Here's Charlie.
All right, I thank you very much. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ solidly in the green. Stocks up for an 8th straight day. That is the longest winning streak in 2024. Traders hoping that the Fed will be signaling it's ready to start cutting rates. So here's where we stand. S&P right now up 33 points, a gain of 0.6%. The Dow up 177, up 0.4%. The NASDAQ Composite Index up 132, up 0.7%. And the Russell 2000 Index of small cap shares up now by 0.8%. 10-year 3.85%, with a 2-year 4.05%. Spot gold down $4 the ounce, 25.03, a drop there of 0.2%, and a 3.1% drop now for West Texas Intermediate crude back below $75 a barrel, 74.32 on WTI. Advanced Micro Devices is buying server maker ZT Systems in a cash and stock transaction valued at $4.9 billion, adding data center technology that will bolster its efforts to challenge NVIDIA. Shares of AMD up now by 3.2%. NVIDIA shares, they're also advancing today, up by 3.3%. Again, recapping here, stocks higher across the board. A Monday rally underway with the S&P up 33, up 0.6. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, Charlie, thanks so much. Do appreciate that. Well, the Democratic National Convention this week kicks off, and it marks the ceremonial crowning of Vice President Kamala Harris and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as the party's presidential nominees. It caps off a whirlwind month for Democrats who have quickly coalesced behind the new ticket after President Joe Biden dropped out of the race just a few weeks ago. That was back in July. We've got with us Joe Matthew. He's the co-host of Bloomberg Balance of Power, and he's part of Bloomberg TV and radio's special coverage on the ground in Chicago for the Democratic National Convention. Joe, good to see you this afternoon. I think the first question I have is, because you were at the RNC a little over a month ago, just compare and contrast sort of the first day, the vibe, how people are feeling, what people are talking about. How does it feel different?
Sure. Well, I suppose they're actually pretty similar. You know, if you really want to talk about the delegates who show up in a city like this or in Milwaukee, in the case of Republicans, they're there to party. This is a rally. This is the culmination of a lot of hard work by these campaigns. But the moment that we're in here for Democrats is quite remarkable, knowing that when we were in Milwaukee, for the RNC, we had no idea that Kamala Harris was going to be accepting her party's nomination here in Chicago, and so many other things have changed around it. Tonight, that will come to fruition with President Biden essentially delivering somewhat of a farewell address. It's not going to be backward-looking, as we heard from Anita Dunn, his close advisors talking to CNN earlier, said this will be about the future. He's going to make the argument for why Kamala Harris should be the next president of the United States, as opposed to talking about his many years in Washington and in politics here. But this is the inflection point tonight, Tim. When Joe Biden finishes his address, he's going to leave Chicago. He's actually going to go on vacation with his family to California for the week, and he will not appear again here. And over the course of each day, we'll move a little bit further into the future until we get to Kamala Harris on Thursday night. Tim Walz will speak on Wednesday. They've got themes as they do at all of these conventions. Tonight it's for the people, which sounds very Joe Biden, and he'll be embracing that message when he speaks to the American people in prime time.
What else do you expect in terms of the tone that both Joe Biden and his family members are going to take tonight?
Well, that's the question, Emily, that we keep asking. You know, there's been a lot of reporting that Joe Biden is angry, that Jill Biden is angry, that they feel betrayed by some people in the Democratic Party, including Nancy Pelosi, who worked very hard behind the scenes to reportedly get him out of this race. But I don't think that's what we're going to see and hear on stage. This is a very carefully choreographed moment for the party. And Joe Biden's job tonight is to try to get Kamala Harris elected. He endorsed her. He's got his fingerprints on this pick. Of course, she wouldn't be here if she weren't his vice president. So I think you're going to hear a lot of positive vibe tonight. There's going to be a rally, kind of campaign feel in the room, and more of the vitriol, I think, will be left for behind the scenes.
Yeah, well, to that end, Joe, it may be choreographed inside the room, inside the convention hall, but what's happening outside is certainly getting a lot of attention. When it comes to protesters, have you seen any? What's the vibe outside of the convention hall like? To what extent is it distracting from Democrats' message right now?
It's really supposed to start today. We've got 4 or 5 groups that are permitted and will be marching, but we're talking, Tim, about tens of thousands potentially of protesters, and there are groups that do not have permits. Police are trying to figure out the best way to deal with that, in some cases letting them proceed to avoid arresting thousands of people. But we did see a few folks out on the streets last night, some pretty big groups actually on Michigan Avenue, close to where we're staying here. It made it difficult to get in and out of the hotel and so forth, but nothing on the level that has been feared. You hear the comparisons to 1968 and concerns that there will be images of violence, billy clubs, mass arrests, this type of thing, pepper spray. Nothing like that has occurred yet. And I'll point you to breaking news on the terminal today now, as Secretary of State Antony Blinken says there is a new ceasefire deal that Benjamin Netanyahu has signed off on. We're waiting to hear from Hamas. If something like that were to emerge during this Democratic National Convention, it could mean a very different conversation and really blunt the message that a lot of these protesters have. The other thing I'll add, Tim, is that there are 30 delegates in the building who are uncommitted to Kamala Harris. They call themselves ceasefire delegates. And it's all about this one issue. They're pro-Palestinian delegates, and they too could change their tune if we see potentially a ceasefire deal put together this week. We're going to have to wait and see what happens.
What else are you expecting for the convention in terms of speakers that maybe you think will be a highlight this week?
Well, look, the highlight, of course, is the primetime address by Kamala Harris, but it's interesting to see how the Democratic Party is sprinkling in some of the big names from the past. Former President Bill Clinton is going to be speaking. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube, you can see that Barack Obama is going to talk tomorrow night as they start to turn attention away from Joe Biden and toward Kamala Harris. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has just been added to the list for tonight, by the way, or at least that was just unveiled. We're going to hear from Hillary Clinton tonight as well, and the First Lady, Jill Biden. So not so much backward looking, but some names from the past in the Democratic Party as we gear up to the unveiling of the nominee later this week.
Hey, Joe, one name that we have not talked a lot about in the last 8 minutes has been former President Donald Trump, the Republican nominee. What is he going to do this week to try to suck out some of the air, at least of the media coverage and the attention from the DNC?
Yeah. They're going to be counter-programming over the course of the week, which is interesting because typically a party, I mean, at least in the old days of politics, kind of let the party have their week, let them get all the speechifying done, and then start hitting them hard on the weekend to blunt the argument here, knowing that the party typically gets a bounce in the polls coming out of the convention. But the Trump campaign has decided that with the momentum that the Harris camp is enjoying right now, they want to get the former president out on the road as well as Senator J.D. Vance. And they're actually going to be holding events throughout the course of the week. You're going to see Donald Trump likely taking questions from reporters so he can remind everybody that Kamala Harris has not. And that's likely something that will follow the convention. We'll see a round of interviews and a lot of travel. They'll go on a road trip to take the message to the people here. But it is true. Kamala Harris has not done a news conference or sat down for an interview with a journalist to answer hard questions since this all changed 4 weeks ago. And the question is when she will finally feel enough pressure to do that, Tim.
Joe, last question. She did see some positive news when it came to polling. New York Times Siena poll over the weekend, putting some states back in play because of gains that she has made there. What should we keep an eye on for in terms of polling and potential bump for the Harris campaign in the days following the convention?
Well, we are super focused on the swing states. That's why our Bloomberg News Morning Consult poll focuses exclusively on the 7 states that'll decide this election as opposed to a national poll. But you're right, Washington Post, Ipsos, over the weekend here with a very important poll for Kamala Harris. She's beating Donald Trump in a head-to-head by 49 to 45%. There's another number in the poll, though, that's a lot more interesting to me, and that is independent voters. That's the real fight here. We know this is going to be a close election, and that slice in the middle of independents who could turn either D or R are really the voters that we're talking about here. And we saw quite a bit of improvement over Joe Biden here. Kamala Harris is now leading Donald Trump by 8 points among independents. Wow. Joe Biden was leading by only 2. So just in a couple of weeks' time, a very important shift in the numbers that we'll keep track on coming out of Chicago as well.
All right, still more than 2 months to go, though, as we are constantly reminded. A big thank you to Joe Matthew, co-host of Bloomberg Balance of Power, part of Bloomberg Television and Radio's special coverage on the ground in Chicago for the Democratic National Convention. Bloomberg Radio will have live coverage of President Biden's keynote address at the Democratic National Committee Convention beginning at 10:30 p.m. Wall Street time tonight. So that's the word from Chicago, the word on the politics front. Now for more in the markets, and that is that greed has overcome fear on Wall Street. And the market cataclysm that shook up the world in recent weeks may well prove a mere blip on the long-term price charts. Denitsa Sikova is Bloomberg News cross-asset reporter. She's here in the Bloomberg Business Week studio. Denitsa, 2 weeks ago, we would have been sitting in this studio talking about a potential emergency rate cut as a result of what was happening in the markets, that, you know, softer than expected jobs number that came out the Friday before, 2 weeks ago Monday. My, how things have shifted. 8 days in a row higher on the S&P 500. What's going on here?
Yeah, it's really incredible reversal. As fast as fear was taking hold of markets, we saw need for tail risk protection. We saw obviously the VIX going so high, and now we're close to a record high. We just saw the biggest cross-asset rally this year. VIX is below 15. So everything that was worrying investors in the span of a couple of days disappeared even faster. And a lot of people are asking, what happened? Why is that? Obviously, technical forces have been a big aspect of this. We talk a lot about systematic selling. That has been definitely a big part. That's a growing universe of investors who are very sensitive to volatility, towards reversal trends, and they don't need fundamental reasons to sell. They need a trigger, and we saw some of those triggers activated. Of course, we're coming from a year where everyone was heavily concentrated in Magnificent Seven. Everyone was buying tech stocks. That was the only game in town. And you can imagine when something happens, everyone runs to the exits. And this is where we are.
So what are we seeing in terms of positioning now when you look at the data about where systemic funds are buying, what ETF flows look like? How are funds positioned for the rest of the year?
We actually saw a very sharp decrease in equity positioning from systematic investors. For example, volatility-controlled investors were so high in their equity exposure, they were at 110%, and they went back all the way to 50. So that said, those people are slowly seeing some buying. For sure, that's amount of pressure that we saw in a matter of days we can no longer see because they're a lot more well-balanced. So that type of tension is no longer there. We saw some de-risking from fundamental investors, but also a lot of people were buying the dip. Of course, Monday was a day where we saw a lot of volatility, reach for hedges, but rest of the days, investors weren't that risk averse, so we saw a lot of buying. So going forward, we may see potential support from those systematic forces that drove the indices down. And also positioning is still quite high, but it's not as stretched as it used to be. So in terms of technical forces, maybe they're more positive to what's going forward.
Okay, what about the fundamental macro forces that have caused traders and investors in recent weeks to take a step back and think, okay, wait a second, things might not be as bad as we thought they are.
Yes, for sure. We have seen those economic prints really rattling investors. When there is economic print, obviously, that's good for the soft landing. The market has been reacting very well. But we've seen any small print that's a little bit of disappointment also causing major drama in markets. So I think the biggest takeaway from what's going forward is positioning is still stretched. We just had this shock and investors are on edge. And obviously, fundamentally, we don't see a lot of people are talking about the VIX being so high, and many of the other occasions there was a global pandemic. There were a lot of really big fundamental reasons and fears, and this wasn't the case this time. But still, we're waiting for Jackson Hole. We're potentially about to see our first rate cut, and every little data point says a lot about what happens in the future meeting. Are we going to see 50 basis points? So yes, maybe we're no longer worried about rate cuts that's happening now, but we are still very vigilant about what the next steps are after September, maybe.
Just looking at equities, there was a lot of talk about a rotation trade in the last few weeks. We saw flows into small caps. People were talking about, buying the equal weighted S&P. What are your sources saying now? Because now I'm looking at the NASDAQ 100. It's still up 16% year to date. We still have NVIDIA earnings coming up. It still feels like there's a lot of positive sentiment towards the big tech AI plays that were working earlier in the year. And all this talk about a rotation, it's kind of dying down, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's been a big trend of maybe a lot of people are saying everyone will go from big tech to like other places. But what we have seen is that indeed, unloved places of the market are getting more love than they used to have. But also some of the deep buying we saw during the last few days of the rally, a lot of that money did go to big tech. Again, we're seeing some of the big names seeing more gains. But also if you look at last week was the first time since May that we saw all 11 sectors rally at the same time. So we are seeing some breadth, but the story is not everyone's moving away from big tech and is going to small caps. It's a more balanced way of investors are putting money in other places, but people are still buying tech.
Denitza, a couple minutes left. I want to talk about catalysts and get an understanding for what catalysts potentially lie ahead. We have NVIDIA earnings on the 28th. We're not quite done with earnings yet. Palo Alto Networks after the bell today. Jackson Hole, is that what everybody's watching this week?
I think Jackson Hole is definitely the biggest one. In economic data, we have jobless claims. Obviously, that's not one of the biggest indicators, but investors have been so sensitive to any sign of weakness or strength in the job market that I think we can imagine that every economic data print can definitely move markets a lot more than we have seen in the past. And what we learned from that event is that there are a lot of forces like maybe liquidity issues, investors heard it, quantitative forces. So I think even with this week where we don't have that much economic data coming in, we could potentially see some reactions there, and any indication and comment about what happens after September is obviously a massive thing that everyone is looking for.
Denitza Sokova, Bloomberg News cross-asset reporter here in the Bloomberg Business Week studio. Check out all of her reporting on the Bloomberg terminal and, of course, also at Bloomberg.com. Denitza did mention that we're seeing stocks higher today. The S&P 500 higher by 0.6%, while the NASDAQ composite higher by 0.8%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average right now higher by just about 0.4%. As we mentioned, stocks higher for an 8th straight day. It's the longest winning streak so far in 2024. Well, coming up next on Bloomberg Business Week, it is Merger Monday. We're going to talk about the operator of Circle K making a proposal to take over the much larger rival 7-Eleven owner 7 & I Holdings. That's coming up next on Bloomberg Business Week. This is Bloomberg.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ. We'll throw in the Russell 2000, all advancing back to work Monday. A 32-point gain right now on the S&P. We stand at 55.86, up by about 0.6%. Just about the best level of the day, very close to it. The Dow up by 143 points now, up 0.4%. NASDAQ up 0.8%, while the Russell 2000 doing a little bit better right now, up by 0.9%. 10-year 3.85%, the 2-year 4.05%. Gold down 0.2%, 25.03 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude oil down 3.1%, 74.28 for a barrel of WTI. Bottom line here, stocks up again, up for an 8th straight day. That is the longest winning streak in 2024. Circle K operator Alimentation Couche-Tard has made an offer to take over much larger rival and 7-Eleven owner Seven & I Holdings in what would be the biggest foreign takeover of a Japanese company. A merger will create the world's top operator of roughly 100,000 convenience stores. We got ADRs right now of Alimentation Couche-Tard trading lower. They're down by 1.6%. So again, recapping, stocks higher. S&P up 33, up 0.6%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thanks so much for that update, Charlie. Do appreciate it. We just heard the headline from Charlie, but worth repeating. Alimentation Couche-Tard, the operator of Circle K and Canada's most valuable retailer, making a proposal to take over the much larger rival and 7-Eleven owner Seven & I Holdings. A merger would create the world's top operator of roughly 100,000 convenience stores. Shares of Seven & I Holdings jumped 23% today. That company, by the way, was valued at the equivalent of $31 billion before news of the offer emerged. Let's get to it with Crystal C., Bloomberg News deals reporter. She joins us from Switzerland. Crystal, I want to talk about this deal in particular, but then branch out and talk about the deal space in particular, especially what happened in July and what that could suggest for the deals moving forward. What do we know about this particular deal? Because Couche-Tard has not given many details.
Not much detail. We don't know the price. So far, we know that Couche-Tard has submitted a friendly offer to Seven & I. It's not a hostile takeover. It is going to be a negotiated transaction. If anything were to come to any kind of fruition, I guess the company can hash out kind of management roles as well as how units are going to be operated. And speaking of, just M&A transaction, like you said, since July, it's been a flurry of deal making, and which is a very interesting timing as everybody looks at the end of the year. There's an election looming, but still there are a lot of deals that seems to be cooking up.
So much for bankers and lawyers being on vacation right now. You mentioned the idea of a friendly takeover versus a hostile takeover. Just remind our audience the difference between the two and what we should be watching for in a friendly type of deal.
Yeah, so I think in a friendly transaction, you just get to have a more, a lot more happen behind the scene. Whereas in a hostile takeover, a company just put in an offer, and a lot of that would play out in public statements. The target would say, okay, this isn't a good enough offer, or we're evaluating this, evaluating that. But if this were to go as planned, like how Couche-Tard and Seven & I had described, it would most likely be mostly played out behind the scene, which is difficult for us, but great for the companies in some way.
So, Crystal, this merger would create the world's top operator of roughly 100,000 convenience stores. I'm wondering where across the world are these stores spread out? Obviously, we know 7-Eleven is in the U.S., but give us a little bit more of a sense of just how global this deal is.
So Seven & I is trading in Tokyo, and a lot of its operation is in Tokyo. 7-Eleven brand was started in Texas, but actually had a global footprint now. And if you remember, 7 & I also had had made a takeover approach a couple of years ago to buy the Speedway convenience store gas stations in the U.S. So they actually have a really